Good afternoon and welcome to the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee inquiry into retrofitting homes for net zero. This follows on from our predecessor committee's inquiry on heating our homes. We will principally be focusing on the retrofit of existing homes and cover topics including government retrofit support schemes, helping households to make informed decisions, the rollout of low carbon heating technologies and workforce challenges. The UK housing stock accounts for around 17% of national emissions and is among the least energy efficient in Europe. So there is much to discuss, and we have three panels this afternoon, starting with our first panel who I will ask to introduce yourselves, starting on my left, please.
Yeah, I'm Mayor Fitchett. I'm a policy analyst at National Energy Action. I live and work on a fair and affordable transition to net zero.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Robert Panou. I'm Director of Asset Strategy at Stonewater, a 40,000 unit national housing provider.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jo Wheeler. I'm co-head of policy and places at UK Green Building Council. UKGBC is a charity and a membership organisation with around 700 members across the property and construction sector.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for introductions. You are all most welcome. And for the next hour, we will be asking you questions on this topic. And I have the first question to all of you. It's fair to say the evidence suggests that programmes in the last few years, or progress in the last few years, have been poor. In the 8 months since our predecessor committee heard oral evidence for its Heating Our Homes inquiry, we've seen the change of government. Has what the new government announced put us in a better place? As you're nodding, I'll go first. Go first.
Oh, yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. I mean, for a start, in sort of numerical figures, this government has pledged more than the last government did, so we're sort of optimistic about that. We feel like we're working in an environment where our concerns are largely shared and sort of heard, which is positive. In specifics, the plans, sort of initial plans for the Warm Homes Plan seem very positive. We hope to see that spending sort of committed in the spending review next year. Turnaround on the minimum energy efficiency standard consultation seems positive, and so yeah, overall we're more optimistic, and our sort of initial view is that this government looks to have a much more ambitious approach.
Right. Well, we'll get into the detail as we go through. Robert, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the new Warm Home Plan, we welcome, as a social housing provider, we welcome the additional funding, and we can see that how that ties into our 30-year business plan in order to increase the number of homes we retrofit. I think the biggest challenge we face as a housing sector at the moment is the practicalities over delivery. The Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is a very, very difficult project and programme to deliver, and that's been repeated over the previous two rounds. We've been involved in both Wave 1 and Wave 2. And the administrative challenges and the way the project has set up has been very challenging, not just for the housing associations I've worked for, but the sector as a whole.
Great. Well, I think we will want to explore in more detail what you mean and what you think this government needs to do to ensure you get what you're asking for. Jo, did you say Joan or Joanne?
Either's fine, but Jo usually.
Jo, right, thank you. What's your sense?
Yeah, I think we too are feeling more optimistic and more positive since the new government has come to power. We absolutely welcome the increased investment, the doubling of investment for retrofit to 13.2 billion. But unfortunately, this is still not enough. We've developed a retrofit investment calculator where you can go on and kind of play chancellor to see, how many social homes you want to fund, how many fuel-poor homes, etc. And we estimate that something like 60 billion investment will actually be needed over 10 years. And that would fund low-income households, social housing, a national information service, skills training, and things like local authority capacity building. But also the point I want to make is it's not just about the money. The calculator shows that even with 60 billion over 10 years, we're still going to need a suite of complementary policies to support retrofit, and particularly to encourage homeowners who represent the majority of households. I think 64% of homes in England are owner-occupied, so we really need to see some policies coming in to encourage and support homeowners to retrofit their homes with their own money.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Which moves me on to the next question, actually. Is the Warm Homes Plan prioritising the right things? You seem to suggest maybe there needs to be an adjustment there, Joan.
Well, we haven't. There was sort of scant detail in what was released last week around the Warm Homes Plan. I think we just saw the press release, so we're awaiting further details. We were pleased to see funding allocations and updates to existing schemes and implementation of the Clean Heat Market Mechanism. On the Clean Heat Market Mechanism, we think that's a step in the right direction to build on. It's helping to set a clear direction of travel for heat pump manufacturers. But again, back to my point, we still need other policies alongside to really drive action, like minimum energy efficiency standards, a shifting of subsidy away from electricity to gas, and something that we are very much in favour is a stamp duty incentive linked to warm homes, which I can talk more about if you would like.
Great, thanks very much. And Mayor, do you think that the priorities are right?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Joe said there. Likewise, we were pleased to see that sort of down payment of 3.2 billion towards local authority-led schemes. We also put out a report at the beginning of this year quantifying the fuel poverty investment gap, and it found that it stood at £18 billion, and that was to get us to the fuel poverty target. I think that £13.2 billion under the Warm Homes Plan needs to be directed at fuel-poor households specifically in order to satisfy that target. And we also, as Joe mentioned, we also need those minimum energy efficiency standards in order to leverage private investment in from landlords. We've also recommended a self-referral scheme to capture households that are falling through sort of local authority-led schemes and supplier-led schemes at the moment.
Great. Robert?
Similar to my colleagues, really, I just wanted to, we welcome the additional investment that's been announced, but just want to echo sort of three areas that are missing, really. One is in terms of long-term policy position on the phasing out of fossil fuels. The electricity rebalancing, which my colleague Joanne's mentioned, and incentivising a move towards electric heating. Just those 2 points.
Great, thank you very much. The government set a target to retrofit 5 million homes over 5 years. To what extent does the target keep the UK on track to achieve net zero and match the government's ambition to achieve clean power 2030? Robert, do you want to go first for this question?
Could you just repeat that question, please?
Yeah, we've got the 5 million homes over 5 years as the retrofit target. Does it keep the UK on track to achieve net zero, and does it match the government's ambition to achieve clean power by 2030?
Partially. I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly within the housing sector, it's unclear what the long-term policy goals are in terms of achieving net zero by 2050. As a sector, we don't really know what that looks like. As organisations which own around 40% of the UK housing stock, and us operating 30-year business plan, it's important and to understand what the long-term goals are for the government, so we can structure our business plans accordingly.
You're looking for those to be set out in the detail that comes out with the Warm Homes Plan?
Yeah, so we do, like I said, we operate 30-year business plans, so in order to secure funding for those 30-year business plans, we need that long-term vision. Right.
Mayor?
In short, no. I think we're coming up to 5 years away from the 2030 fuel poverty target. We know that there are 6 million households in fuel poverty in England alone this winter, and it's imperative that we meet net zero, but it's also imperative that people aren't cold in their homes.
Yeah. Joan?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we would welcome the target, and it would be, I think, a substantial increase in the amount of retrofit compared to recent years. So it's a positive step, but it's not enough.
Yeah, we want to see you go further.
And we need to retrofit 29 million homes by 2050. So we've got a massive task.
Sure, thank you. Luke, I think you've got a supplementary.
Yeah, thanks very much for your answers. There was a follow-up to Robert, but also just a general question. One of the criticisms of the previous government was that there was a proliferation of schemes. It was confusing, and the government has added more. And then there's also the criticism around short-termism and schemes chopping and changing. I'm just interested in what you think the balance is between perhaps a needed simplification and then the uncertainty that might cause by closing certain schemes down and rolling them into one. So just your view on the needed simplification in future of schemes. And Robert, you mentioned the phase-out date for fossil fuel. I'm not sure whether you were referring to the 2026 date for hydrogen, or whether you could just say a bit more about that.
So, I mean, in terms of the funding regimes, it's very difficult for us to plan long-term programs where we've only got one year grant program, 2-year grant program, and now with the Wave 3 program, 3 years. And I suppose what I asked the committee to look at really is the success of other grant-funded programs within the housing sector, particularly those that have been delivered by Homes England, in terms of increasing the proportion of affordable housing stock across the country. They're very well administered schemes. They consistently deliver on the targets, and they're very welcome by the housing sector as a whole. You know, using the long-term housing grant that's available through Homes England allows us to plan our investment forwards, go to the private sector in order to secure funding, in order to invest in our existing and new homes. So having that fund is great, is available, but you know, from our perspective, in terms of delivering retrofit schemes across our stock, we're having to very much look at bite-sized projects. Okay, so this year we're going to do 100 homes. Well, what does the next 1,000 homes look like? Well, we're not quite sure because the funding's not clear yet.
And sorry, Joe and Maya, on the wider question on the proliferation of schemes and the desire for simplification.
Yeah, I think the message that we hear from our members a lot is a desire for simplification, and also the time frame point is so crucial. So we've had an extension of schemes recently in terms of the time that they're available, and you know, the time that houses can get retrofitted by, because often the schemes were so short that the money would come out and they couldn't find the houses to retrofit in the time available. So that extension of timeline is very welcome, but we don't think it's long enough. And actually, what we need to see is sort of 5-year commitments to 5-year funding programs, and you know, an ongoing commitment to a 10-year rolling program, so that the industry has certainty that this is going to happen, and you know, we can start to build the industry confidence, because at the moment the start-stop nature really undermines confidence. And also, I just wanted to make a point about the eligibility requirements. So we think that we need to simplify the eligibility requirements around the schemes. So, of course, we need to be targeting those most in need, the fuel poor and vulnerable, but those criteria need to be as broad as possible, because at the moment providers and installers are spending a lot of time and money trying to identify the right households to put the measures in, rather than spending the money on actually installing the grants. So a simplification of the criteria would be welcome.
Just coming back to this point about the longer term nature, or the short term versus the long term nature of schemes, have you heard things from the new government that recognises this challenge? Because the previous committee took a lot of evidence about the stop-start nature of schemes.
I think they're definitely trying in terms of, I think that one of the schemes was, I can't remember which one now, sorry, but there was went from being a 1-year thing to a 3-year programme. So there's definitely kind of message getting through, but I think what we feel is needed is really that national retrofit strategy to set out, look, we need to put in this funding, this 5-year commitment, but actually we've got a national strategy for the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll move on to Claire Young, please.
So following on quite neatly from that supplementary question, I think you've already partly answered my first question, because it was around the fact that the take-up of schemes was very poor. We've got the Great British Insulation Scheme, where obviously, even if it achieved its target, it was only going to retrofit about 1% of the homes that need retrofitting, and as it is, it's massively, massively behind. So my first question is, and if you've got anything additional to those points you've already raised, what factors have caused the under-delivery of support schemes in recent years, and how could they be reformed to provide better incentives for homeowners, landlords and social housing providers?
I start. It's definitely the timescale factor. So people literally running out of time to be able to implement the schemes. and find the right households to be able to, receive the funding. I think from the public perspective, there's a confusion about what schemes they are eligible for, whether, how there's not an understanding of the eligibility for the various different schemes amongst the general public, so they don't know often that they're entitled to help. And I think that comes down to needing a national energy advice service. So EST, the Energy Saving Trust, used to run that in England. It still does in Wales and Scotland. And then they can triage people and send them to the right local support. Because the other aspect of this we think is really important is local delivery and local trust. So, if delivery is targeted at the local level, then you can build that confidence and spread the word amongst communities that, this scheme is legitimate, and neighbours tell each other about it, and you get that kind of take up. But at the moment we don't have that, so people are sort of searching for their customers.
If I can turn to Robert, does the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund give you the support and confidence you need?
From a financial perspective, it does over the short term. I think the biggest challenge, it goes back to what Joanne said, in terms of time. Yeah. So in terms of putting a programme of delivery together, Stonewater's looking to deliver around 2,500 upgrades to properties under the next round of funding. It's a very short window from when the requirements of the project or the programme are released to when we've actually got to put the bid together. So it's best will in the world. It's not a very strategic approach for us, and also it provides limited time to work at a local level, particularly delivering partnerships with local authorities, for example, to develop local area or local energy action plans. And then again, under the current round, we've only got 3 years to deliver it. In an ideal world, we'll be able to put projects and programmes through on a rolling basis and continue to bid into the fund over a much longer period.
Thank you. And finally, on this area of the factors that are causing problems, would you, and this is a question for all of you really, would you support the alignment of retrofit support schemes into a single fund to streamline the experience for consumers or providers, or do you see downsides to that?
I think it's really important that sort of existing schemes, namely eco, is continued, and yeah.
Can I just ask if I can just ask why you think it's particularly important that that's continued?
I think alluding to what the other two panellists have said already, providing that certainty is going to be absolutely crucial. And if we look at schemes that are delivering and schemes that aren't, I think the main factor there is sort of longevity of funding and certainty. Providing that certainty for ECO to continue past 2026 now is going to be crucial for that sort of industry confidence. It also sits outside of Treasury funding, so it's, for that reason.
So it's important to you that some existing schemes at least continue because they're already established, they're understood.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, sort of. Yeah. Yeah. Somewhat sort of consumers understand them. Yeah. Can
I follow up on that?
Please.
I'm really surprised. I mean, I can see the point about eco being outside the Treasury envelope, but I've seen no evidence for a long time that eco has got good performance outcomes, operates well with local authorities, has good, and is successful for its overall purpose. So I'd be interested, beyond the fact that it is outside of the Treasury envelope. I mean, I'm not yet convinced that there is any purpose in eco continuing in its current form, because it's so rubbish at delivery. It's rubbish at targeting and it's rubbish at delivery.
And when you're, I was going to add to that. You mentioned this point about consumers having confidence. I'm not sure.
No consumers.
I'm not sure many consumers know about it. I don't know if you. I mean,
Sure,
Please say why justify what you said.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I would argue that eco is actually over-delivering by the sort of targets that it's set up to deliver. So it's delivering to less households than was set out in the impact assessment, but the scheme incentivises bill savings, and it is delivering on that. I agree there are some design issues. I would argue they're not deliverability issues, they're design issues that definitely need to be rectified. But to me, that's all the more reason to consult on eco, on a new iteration of eco as soon as possible, and start to sort of build those design changes into the scheme in order to deliver past 2026.
Do you have any arguments against the money being allocated to local authorities who might be better at delivering it than energy companies?
I suppose the sort of underspend that's existed within local authority-led schemes up to this point, I think, is 53% under current schemes.
Well, that's not true of the Green Home Grant, which is considered to be much better to the LAD than anything the private sector did. So I think underspend is questionable generally on local authority delivery.
Although is that a question of local authority capacity against energy company capacity?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I also think the sort of longevity of funding is a key point there as well. ECO's delivered over 4-year schemes. Local authorities, sometimes by the time that bids are written, they're delivering over a year-long scheme.
Oh, quite. Give them longevity of the ecosystem, of the eco funding. They'd be much better at being able to do it, and they know who their people are.
Right. Let's bring in. Sorry, we're just having a conversation with Maya. But let's see what Joan and Robert make of what we've just been saying.
Just to the point of whether it should be one grant scheme, I can definitely see the attractions of that. I would quite like to go back and test that with with the people who deliver these schemes and with local authorities who we talk to on a regular basis to see what they think before giving a. I feel like my view is not well formed enough, but I do think there's different models for funding, and I think the devolution of funds is a really interesting one. And so I think we've seen GM and Greater Manchester and West Midlands getting devolved retrofit funding, and where that capacity is in place to work out where the money needs to go and spend it. I think that's brilliant. I think what the challenge is that local authorities are severely underfunded, some of them, in terms of retrofit capacity. I just heard last week of a retrofit officer, being got rid of basically because the local authority, it's not a statutory duty, so they were cutting excess. So what happens is when local authority funds are given out in a competitive way, those who have the capacity to be able to deliver them bid for them and get the money, and it's a sort of, a self-fulfilling circle, if you like, that those who don't have the capacity to bid don't end up getting in money and then don't get retrofit officers. So you've got some places who are doing really well and other places that really aren't. So we need retrofit officers in every local authority, and we definitely don't have that at the moment.
Thank you. And Robert, anything to add on this topic?
I suppose if we were to remove the social housing decarbonisation fund that's accessed by local authorities and place choice with the consumers, I feel as a sector it will place some significant challenges on our funding. Ultimately we have significant private financing secured against our properties, and I think losing control over being able to retrofit those properties would be challenging for us, and the potential liabilities that came along with it. I think the solution really is about integrating the funds better. So the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund has an allocation for sort of 10% of the properties from outside social housing properties, and the Local Authority Fund has a similar 10% that it can do social housing as well. But by increasing those percentages and perhaps allowing local housing providers or local authorities to do larger proportions, will provide some synergies.
Thank you. Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much. So we've had a bit of discussion about people in fuel poverty. So this question is first to Maya and then the rest of the panel. The government's committed to revising the fuel poverty strategy. So quite a broad question. What would you like to see in it?
Sure. I think we need to see that 2030 target of as many fuel poor households as is reasonably practicable to EPCC by 2030. I think we need to accelerate that path. As I've mentioned, we see a £18 billion investment gap. That 13.2 billion that's been pledged goes some way towards meeting that. We need to see that committed in the spending review in order to fulfil that commitment. And we also need to see that sort of robust regulation in order to drive that private investment. We also want to see that strategy sitting cross departments. So I think fuel poverty is a cross-cutting issue. At an absolute minimum, it should sit across housing, health and energy departments. We think it should consider accessibility, so end the postcode lotteries that sort of Joe was talking about around advice, energy efficiency delivery, grant schemes, and there needs to be a piece around rectifying failed schemes. We've done a lot of work on our project in Fitchett, which I submitted evidence to the committee last year. We also want to see that collaboration across the UK. We see sort of having comprehensive fuel poverty and strategy in place across the UK as a way of being able to assess some of those distributional impacts of fuel poverty and allow for support for devolved nations in a way that hasn't been done by previous governments.
Approach, is there a contradiction between a kind of area-based approach and fuel poverty? Because people in fuel poverty are spread in different areas, and an area-based approach takes it street by street, private rented, owner-occupied, those in the fuel poor. Is there any contradiction between that delivery approach and a fuel poverty strategy? Feel free to come in, Joe.
I was just going to say, I think what we need, ideally, is a much more sophisticated offering where we can offer a street-by-street approach, so different kind of blended finance models for everybody in the street. So one house might be fully funded by grants, the next might be a combination of grants and interest-free loans, the next householder might be able to pay for it all themselves. We need to get much more sophisticated about offering retrofit in different ways to different householders depending on their circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. I think you need diversity of approaches. I think you need both in place. Yeah.
Could I just ask on how we measure fuel poverty? Do we have the right metrics?
So although we use the 10% definition at the moment because it allows for comparability across the UK, and we know that the low income, low energy efficiency definition has some drawbacks. It's sort of moved with the volatility of prices over the past couple of years. We actually see it as really important that the Lilly definition is kept in place. I think that it risks a delay to delivering on the fuel poverty target if we change it now.
And then final question.
Sorry, I just wanted to make a point about the fuel poverty number. Obviously, it's not a static number, and there are households who are at risk of falling into fuel poverty if they lose their job, become ill, for their life circumstances change. And so by not dealing with not dealing with homes across the board, we're not protecting people when they move house, for example. They might fall into fuel poverty. Their last home might have been fine, but the new one's really inefficient, and then they're in fuel poverty. So we need to have a strategic warm homes plan, which is thinking about all households.
Thank you. And sorry.
Can I just add one thing really quickly? We think that funding to local authorities need to be allocated on the basis of need. So looking at fuel poverty levels, looking at sort of indices of multiple deprivation.
And just finally, cold, inefficient homes obviously have a big impact on people's health. Mm-hmm. Should health conditions be part of the eligibility requirements for retrofit schemes?
I mean, yes, I think. I think, again, it needs a much more joined-up approach in terms of doctors and medical professionals being able to refer people for retrofits, working with the local council. This is why we think a local approach is really vital, because you need to understand who the vulnerable households are in the area, who needs help, who needs support, who's going to the doctor because they're living with black mould, and be able to target the right people. At the moment it's a bit random.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Joe said. Local authorities have that knowledge of sort of characteristics within their local areas. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. Joan, in the answer to one of my questions, you mentioned owner-occupiers, and you've touched on it there with the different tenures in the same street. And I know we've had evidence, written evidence, and I think it might be the previous inquiry as well, the previous committee as well, about the scale of the problem for owner-occupiers, where there tends to be the focus on social renters and on private renters. Have you got a particular answer to how the support might be available to owner-occupiers?
There are very, very few policies targeted at owner-occupiers at the moment. The boiler upgrade scheme is one, but that's an expensive grant. What we think is that the grant funding really needs to be targeted at those who most need it, so vulnerable households and fuel poor, but the owner-occupiers who could afford retrofit if they were given means to the right kind of loans, finance mechanisms, perhaps things like property-linked finance ought to be supported to do so. But we also absolutely need a kind of structural driver. I mentioned it before in my introduction. We think a really good way to drive action would be through a warm homes stamp duty rebate, so that stamp duty is nudged up or down depending on the efficiency of the home, and so that people can take the energy efficiency into consideration as they're purchasing a home and understand, how much it's going to cost them to run, etc. And if they upgrade that home within a certain period after moving in, then they can claim the rebate. So it's a real driver to action, and it's a real driver to ensure that the market is valuing energy efficiency, because at the moment we don't. There's no shortage of money, private householders' money going into homes. I think it's something like £15 billion a year spent on new kitchens, 1.3 million new kitchens a year. And people do that partly because they want a really lovely kitchen, but partly because they know when they come to sell their house, it will add value. They're thinking at the moment, if I put a heat pump in, is anybody going to care? Is it going to add value to my home? So we need to start factoring in a value consideration into owner-occupied sector.
Sounds like there's an education piece, an awareness piece. As it was the ONS I was thinking of, just found the reference to it amongst the evidence we've had. Claire.
Just a very, very quick point. We'll probably pick up further on this in a later question, but when deciding how to allocate funding, do you think you should also be taking into account the types of housing stock? Because the amount it costs to upgrade some types of housing would be different. So the same level of fuel poverty may be more expensive to address in some situations than others. And is that, I think, Mayor, you talked about local authorities understanding their housing stock. But is that something you feel should be taken into account when allocating funding?
So you mean more money would need to go to those homes?
Areas which had either, particularly high levels of difficult to retrofit homes?
I think that would make sense, that we need to recognise that some homes are going to be harder to treat than others. And then it's not a flat sum is not going to get everybody up to an EPCC, and so I think there needs to be some flexibility there.
So just add to that, the SHDF funds at both wave 1 and 2 recognise that, and there were some different funding structures for hard to treat homes. I think somebody who's worked in the sector didn't quite go far enough. The cost of retrofitting, particularly homes that were built in 50s, 60s, system-built concrete properties, is significant. And in some respects outweighs the value of those properties to us as a housing association. So there does, I think, within each fund need to be recognition of that.
Thank you very much. Polly Billington.
Thank you, Chair. It sort of follows on from some of the questions that emerged out of that last one. Today we've seen that the government's announced a consultation on the Energy Performance Certificate framework. Does the current EPC framework allow consumers to make informed decisions, do you think, Robert?
One of the main concerns around for us as a sector in terms of the EPC framework is it's set as a metric for us to achieve in terms of ensuring our properties are up to EPCC by 2030. There's some nervousness, having read the consultation this morning, about the impact of that on our decarbonisation programme. As an organisation, as a sector said, we're looking to achieve EPC by 2030, but there is potential within that, particularly if it links to the cost of energy, for all our properties to be down-rated from a C to a D, say, overnight through more focus on the cost of the energy within the measurement framework.
So what kind of reforms would you like to see in the EPC framework?
I think one of the things that's missing from the EPC framework is a drive to more carbon friendly measures. So in my lifetime, I've looked at more EPCs than I care to remember. And what you see in a lot of those properties which aren't achieving good energy standards, let alone carbon-free performance, is recommendations, even if they're on gas heating, say, is recommendations for the typical type of things, so insulation upgrades and new windows. Actually, what they don't do is they don't demonstrate what saving can be delivered to the consumer or carbon savings to the environment by making recommendations above and beyond the gas heating system that's already in there, say. It stops at the insulation. It doesn't go far enough in terms of driving consumer behaviour through the EPC.
And it disincentivises heat pump installation over boilers.
Completely.
Yeah. So should there be a carbon metric introduced alongside the cost metric in EPC?
Yes.
Aya?
I think affordability, EPCs being a measure of affordability, is our sort of key concern. It's crucial in identifying and measuring fuel poverty. It's crucial in being able to identify that overlap between low energy efficiency homes and low income households. I think a carbon metric could be useful, but it needs to not sort of outweigh an affordability metric.
You would accept that at the moment it is creating perverse incentives for installing old-fashioned fossil fuel infrastructure into people's homes, and
Completely accept there's a need.
Tying them into ways of heating their homes which are potentially pushing them on their pathway to an ongoing fuel poverty.
Completely accept there's a need for EPC reform, but it needs to remain a measure of affordability and of energy efficiency.
Okay.
Do you accept the need to transition to non-fossil fuel heating?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry,
that doesn't need to come into conflict with affordability measures.
Now, some other countries have got kind of an online one-stop shop, and I've been knocking around this business long enough to know that everybody thinks that this is going to be the solution to everything. Forgive me my cynicism, but should this be replicated in the UK?
I'm happy to go first. Or do you want to?
Happy, anyone?
What's missing, I think, is access to a lot of the trustmark information that's produced from these decarbonisation programmes. So, Stonewater alone will have published over the past few years 800 outputs from retrofit projects on individual properties, and that information is shared with trustmark. And that can serve as brilliant case studies to encourage people who are living in pretty much similar properties to the ones that Stonewater own, in order to understand what measures, the cost of, and the improvements that have happened to those properties. But it's inaccessible at the moment. So in terms of that one-stop shop, it doesn't necessarily need to be anything physical or tangible, but there's things that exist already, valuable things that exist already, but we just data which we just don't which we don't have access to. So wouldn't it be great if somebody could, somebody who lived next door to one of the Stonewater's properties could log on and see what works were done within their local area and say, brilliant, I can apply that to my home now, and those are the benefits that I will reap.
Okay.
I would agree that they're not a silver bullet one-stop shops, but I do think that they would be a very good step forward. But both in terms of like a triage service. So I mentioned before, I think what we need is a national service which can see what kind of help the individual householder who's calling needs and point them to local services where they can get that help. And I think that they're also a good answer for climate motivated or money motivated, whatever the motivation of the householder is, to go and seek advice and get that impartial advice and get access to trusted tradespeople and sort of remove all of the hassle associated with retrofit. Having done 2 retrofits, one in London where I had the advice of a one-stop shop and one in Devon where I didn't, because one didn't exist at the time, I'm very much in favour of that hand-holding to support people through the process, because it's really difficult to do it on your own and you don't know, even as a person working in the sector, I struggled to find the right people and to know what was the right thing to do for my house. So I think that they are definitely part of the solution. They're not the whole solution, and we will need other drivers and other policy measures, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen the market itself generate people's ability to be able to say, we can simplify this pathway for you Is it something that needs intervention, or should the market be able to deliver that kind of advice?
I think there is intervention required there. Our work in Fishwick in particular has shown us that some of the most vulnerable households will need much deeper support than just advice provision. Retrofit can cause stress and anxiety for lots of fuelable households already dealing with that stress and anxiety. Existing barriers are just amplified. We have just been piloting 2 community retrofit hubs with an aim to sort of build trust within communities in order to sort of encourage households to want to come on this journey to net zero with us and sort of help them understand the benefits of measures and provide that sort of end-to-end support. And I think that sort of trust-building exercise is going to be absolutely crucial for the success of net zero and decarbonisation.
And if I may, I would say, we've got 29 million households to retrofit by 2050, and so there's no shortage of different services going to be required. So I think it's going to be horses for courses. There's some people who will just want to go to a kind of privately run service and do it themselves, and that's absolutely fine. There's others who will absolutely need support, and I think local authority intervention in supporting them. And also the other benefit of having a locally based one-stop shop is the creation of local capacity, supply chain, jobs, all of those, that local economic development.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Torkel.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for coming in with very thought-provoking evidence. Robert, you made energy performance certificates sound like the bane of your life. But the government are consulting on new minimum energy standards for the rented sector, for the private and socially rented sector by 2030. And the challenge is huge. If something like 50% of houses are over 60 years old, and we need to retrofit 29 million homes over the next 20 years. Does that, these proposals for minimum energy efficiency standards for rented accommodation, do they go far enough? Mia, you can answer first, in terms of improving energy efficiency for renters.
It's current standards or proposed standards?
The proposed 2030 ones. They're going to bring them up to Band C, I think, aren't they?
I think this is going to be absolutely crucial to sort of reduce levels of fuel poverty in the private rented sector. I think it's really important that we push these through. We know that a quarter of households in the private rented sector are in fuel poverty, and we've only seen a 4% reduction in fuel poverty in that sector since 2010 compared to 54% in the social housing sector. So yeah, they're absolutely important, but I think there's a sort of suite of complementary policies that need to come alongside increased MEES. That's things like a landlord register to provide accountability, allow local authorities to enforce MEES, an increased cost cap. We know that the current cost cap doesn't go anywhere near to sort of serving the amount that's going to cost to upgrade lots of homes. And then there's also a sort of wider suite of renters protections, such as those detailed in the Renters' Rights Bill, that we would support coming in alongside MEES to ensure that the costs of MEES aren't passed on to households.
So it's a bit of enforcement would help then. I guess I'm a typical example. Rented 19th century, 20th century property. Landlord's installed double glazing, but it still leaks. The house still leaks heat. How would my landlord's a good landlord, but is he incentivized to get rid of his gas boiler, and not put double glazing in? How are we going to do that? Robert, you can.
I think in terms of enforcing standards, I think it does need to go beyond just targeting the EPC. I mean, we've seen throughout the years, in terms of retrofit measures fitted to properties poorly. Older properties were designed to be, in some instances, quite drafty. So go and wrap them with some external wall insulation and double glazing, and they cease to be drafty, and they become mouldy. So I think in terms of enforcing a minimum standard linked to an EPC, say, it does need to go hand in hand with enforcing standards in terms of the quality of homes. And I know the implementation of things like Alweb's Law is in the making, and as an individual, as somebody who works in the housing sector, and for the sector itself, it's something that we recognise. So where there is an improvement in energy performance, I think it needs to go hand in hand with things like that.
Yeah, we're going to have to retrofit something like 2 houses a minute for the next 25 years. Can we achieve these targets realistic?
Speaking from my experience, not just at Stonewater, but in working for other housing associations, across the country, big and small. I mean, we have a deliverable plan in place, so we know which properties we need to work on. We know which properties won't achieve the required energy measures, and for those that can, we know at an individual property level what needs to be done and the costs associated it. So I think as a sector, as a social housing sector, I think we'll get there. I don't think there's enough within the owner-occupier space in order to incentivise them to achieve as much as we will as a social housing sector.
Mm-hmm. You anticipate the next question, and Joe, you touched on this as well, how to incentivise owner-occupiers. And I wonder, should there be more of a focus on owner occupancy?
Yes,
yeah,
definitely, as well as the other sectors as well, not forgetting the other sectors, of course. But yeah, as I said, 64% of homes in England are owner-occupied. And, you know, we all know that the UK has it's a bit property obsessed, right, in terms of, you know, all of the property shows that are about doing up your home, etc. So, as I said before, I think 1.3 million new kitchens are installed every year, largely in the owner-occupied sector, and so there's no shortage of renovation work going on and builders going into people's homes. It's just that people aren't thinking about energy efficiency and comfort and warmth in the same way, and they're not thinking about it because they don't think it adds value to their home, etc. So yeah, it brings me back to the need for something like a structural driver, like the Warm Homes stamp duty.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea, because people talk about property prices all the time, but they never build in heat efficiency into it.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's not like they don't want the disruption of their kitchen. I mean, it is really disruptive to get a new kitchen, but people still do it.
Yeah. Mia, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, sure. Just on incentivising owner-occupiers, I think it's really difficult to regulate the owner-occupier sector in the same way that you can with the private and social rented sectors, given that some owner-occupiers will be in fuel poverty, will lack the agency or the sort of means to increase the energy efficiency of their homes. One of the things that we've recommended is a self-referral scheme. So this would be sort of national, fully funded retrofit programme targeted at fuel-poor owner-occupiers. And it would sort of offer those incentives with fully funded grants in order to improve the sector.
Thank you. And finally, and briefly, I mean, houses contribute almost half the carbon we release into the atmosphere, warming our homes. What should we do to contribute to carbon reduction in our homes?
As individuals? Well, if one can afford it, then insulate first. The first thing to do would be get a qualified retrofit assessor to come around and assess your house and give you an impartial guide to what you ought to do to your home, and, you know, in which order you ought to do it and how much it might cost and what the carbon savings, energy savings would be, etc. Then you decide which, this is the beauty of a one-stop shop, because they can provide this service. Then you decide which retrofit measures you want to install, depending on what your budget, etc. And then, you know, ideally put something like a heat pump in with solar, possibly a battery, so that your home is smart as well and suited to that more flexible, smart energy use in the coming years.
And incentivise behaviour by measures that you suggested there, like attaching it to property value.
Yeah, and I think we also need a suite of financial mechanisms to help people to afford this, because these things are expensive, but it's an investment in your property, especially if it's then factored into the value. But we need, so I know organisations like the Green Finance Institute are looking at property-linked finance, where the loan stays with the property rather than you as an individual. So when you move out, the loan continues to be paid off by the person who moves in. So there are innovative finance mechanisms out there, and they're used in other countries. We just don't have them here yet.
Thank you very much. Josh McAllister.
Thank you, Chair. And the beauty of asking the last set of questions is that most of them have been covered already, so I'll try and keep them brief. There seems to be a bit of a trade-off, really, about the speed and pace of schemes that support rollout, and other aspects like, do we want it to be locally designed, do we want consistency, and the trade-offs about some of those aspects of the policy design. And we've touched a bit on it in answers to other questions, but just to push you all on which of those trade-offs should be prioritised above others. So should we just go for the fastest route to get homes, as many of them as possible, insulated, should we be designing schemes so that local areas can take responsibility and we have an inconsistent rollout, but the take-up can be designed and tailored locally? Or are there other factors that should be considered? And recognising that there are trade-offs in those things. So please don't say all of the above in your answer, unless you've got some magical way of doing it. Jo, do you want to go first?
Well, I was going to say we do need to throw the kitchen sink at this, you know, and I don't think there is any one way of delivering. So we're working with our partners, the MCS Foundation, on looking at a local area retrofit accelerator, where we're working with 4 different areas, bringing together stakeholders on the ground, including the local authority, the supply chain people, social housing providers, etc., to develop with them local retrofit strategies. And I think one of the really important things is that the places are very different. You know, there's some things that can be standardised and some standardised archetype, house types and things, but there's kind of local challenges and local opportunities in terms of supply chain challenges and supply chain opportunity growth, etc., which need a more localised approach.
I guess just to push you, you know, we've got minister and officials in later. They will be facing direct choices about, is this a national centralised scheme, or is it driven through looser local authority or combined authority led deployment or some other mechanism? And there are choices in that. And which one would you advise we take?
My preference would be for there to be a national retrofit strategy, but with local delivery and local support for local authorities to deliver.
Yeah, so national framework, but most of the money going through local.
Some things have to be... It makes sense for us to decide some things at a national level, like standards, for example, whereas others should be locally decided.
Thank you. Robert and Maya, are you in agreement, or have you got a different view?
No, I'd agree that. I think retrofit generally is a complicated endeavour. There's thousands of different property archetypes across the country, and those properties have been extended and altered and changed over the years as well. And nobody's going to know those properties better than the local community and the local authorities, and nobody's going to have the better ability in order to come up with practical, deliverable, measurable action plans to address the challenges in each individual property across local areas.
What's your confidence level in local authorities' ability to deliver?
There's some brilliant examples out there in terms of local energy action plans. I was looking at one this morning up in Yorkshire, Stokesay, I think the name of the place was. And the local authority there had identified what needed to be done to each individual property and the costs associated with those upgrades. And ourselves as a housing association, in terms of 40,000 properties, we know what each property needs in terms of an upgrade. So it is possible. I guess with challenges the local authorities face and cuts in funding, again, it's not statutory responsibility. So it will be inconsistent across the country. But in terms of understanding what's needed in the stock, that really needs to come locally.
Yeah. This point Jo made about national framework, standards, local delivery, the risk of that being really clear is that inconsistency will mean, in some places, much slower rollout, which may contribute to not meeting the targets. And this is that's maybe just a trade-off we have to accept. But do you recognise that? And have you got a sense of the scale of capability gap in local authorities? Not all of them, but in some.
Yeah, I mean,
how would you
I can only really talk from a social housing perspective, having operated in that environment for the past 20 years, and as a sector, and we do operate locally. So I used to work for a local housing association in the West Country, and the capacity and the knowledge existed within that very small housing association to be able to deliver retrofit to a significant number of properties up to 2030 and beyond. So it exists. I guess certainly the local authority there had just made a choice not to invest in building and developing that knowledge within their authority.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I would just go back to what Joe said earlier about this trap of sort of local authorities lacking capacity, unable to win bidding, and I think it's crucial that we move away from a sort of competitive funding model and towards criteria that's defined based on need. We can't just give local authorities more responsibility, we also have to support them with the capacity building around those responsibilities. So RISE, so the Retrofit Information Support and Expertise sort of body that's been set up should hopefully help some of those local authorities overcome some of these capacity issues. But yeah, we need to see support at all stages of the process.
But NEA's view is push as much of this to local authorities to deliver as possible?
I think we want to see a diversification of routes.
Do you recognise the trade-offs that were described, or
in terms of
speed and delivery, and how much is done centrally, nationally versus locally?
Yeah, I think it's important that we get this right, and that it's sort of aimed at low-income households and the worst first. It's taking a sort of worst first approach, and local authorities are uniquely placed to understand the sort of characteristics of their constituents.
Sorry, did you?
Just to say, I do think that there will be a diversity of offerings, and that some people will just want to go to a national supplier as a private householder and get their retrofit from them, and that's fine. And then there should be local offerings as well. So I don't think it's either or. And I would just say, in terms of the speed, I absolutely support the comments around retrofit capacity. You know, they need the skills, they need to be supported with the skills and resource to be able to deliver this. But we also have a problem with the supply chain, which I think maybe you're going to talk about in the next session. But you know, if all local authorities were to turn around tomorrow and go, right, we're doing our retrofit programme, then the supply chain wouldn't be able to cope with that at the moment, so actually some places going further faster, in my view, is not a big problem, because they can test out, you know, what works, and then it can spread to other areas, and you know, in fact they already are. You know, some areas are really leading the way.
Can I just add to the point on supply chain, if that's okay? I mean, it ties into the funding mechanisms that are available for social housing providers as well, and because we go through several short periods of funding being made available within bidding windows, what happens is you get peaks and troughs in demand. So you have the whole housing sector all at once going out to the marketplace in order to procure retrofit experts and contractors and so forth, and as well as making it very difficult to deliver, it naturally drives up costs.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. Analyst, Madeleine.
Thanks, Chair. Segueing into the next session, it just strikes me that during this session we haven't said anything about the workforce who will be delivering this. One of the energy companies has said that we don't have a workforce shortage, but the challenge was upskilling the existing workforce. And while those retrofitting jobs largely remain of low quality, and the heat pump jobs pay less than the gas boiler jobs, with the training as an add-on, there seems to be little motivation for the workforce to upskill. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of what the government can do to make sure that the retrofit jobs are quality jobs and equip the workforce with the skills required to upgrade our UK homes.
Yeah, happy to come in on this briefly. I think the point I made earlier about that sort of long-term certainty of schemes to allow industry to invest in jobs in recruitment is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, based on linked to previous comments, a lot of our retrofit projects are linked to the funding availability, and the funding availability is short. So our contractor partners are sometimes hesitant to invest in developing the supply chain and upskilling the workforce, because they don't know what's going to happen in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, and so forth.
What's the typical pay for one of the workers involved in your retrofit schemes?
I wouldn't know. I mean, I'd be happy to look into it and speak to one of the contractors and put that in writing to the committee. I'm not that close to the supply chain.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just echo what others have said, and you're absolutely right. I think there is a real shortage, and lots of builders who are working at the moment don't need to work in retrofit because they've already got so much work. And also, I think that they are put off training because of the start-stop nature of funding schemes, and many companies have had their fingers badly burnt in the past by investing in trainers and assessors and then the scheme being pulled. So absolutely critical is long-term policy certainty, that this is a long-term plan, and that the funding won't be pulled from underneath them, because then jobs get lost and everyone goes to another sector. So we need that long-term certainty, and that this is a national priority.
Right. Well, thank you all very much. An excellent session of evidence. Very much appreciate you taking part, and we will adjourn very briefly to allow the next panel to take over. Order. And welcome back, and welcome to our second panel this afternoon. Please, would you introduce yourselves briefly, starting with Madeleine?
Hi everyone, I'm Madeleine Gabriel. I'm the Director of Sustainable Future at the innovation charity Nesta, and our focus is on cutting carbon emissions from homes as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Mike?
Mike Foster, Chief Executive of the not-for-profit trade association Energy and Utilities Alliance, and also voluntary independent chair of the community interest company Affordable Warmth Solutions, which delivers the £160 million Warm Home Fund for the fuel pool.
Thank you. And Andy?
Andy Prendergast, National Secretary for the Private Sector for the GMB Trade Union.
Thank you very much, at which point I shall declare my interest as a member of the GMB. Other members will do that as they ask, which is before they ask their questions. First questioner is Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much and welcome to the panel, and I should also declare my membership of the GMB and numerous other trade unions. Can I ask my first question to Madeleine? What are the main barriers, do you think, inhibiting the rollout of clean heat technologies, and how can these be overcome?
One of the main barrier is affordability. That's the thing that we hear most often from households, those, including those who are wealthier and those in fuel poverty or low income situations. In terms of what needs to be done, there's action needed to be taken both on running costs and on upfront costs. On running costs, the key thing that the government needs to do is look at rebalancing levies across electricity and gas bills, and this came up a couple of times in the previous panel. This is tricky to do, but we think there are ways to do it. We've published some research on it this morning. There are trade-offs that need to be made, but we think we can show ways through that would enable both a rebalancing of the price ratio between electricity and gas, which would incentivise electrification, while protecting low-income and vulnerable households, and not costing the government too much more money. We haven't published final conclusions on this yet, but I'll be happy to send our research around to the panel afterwards. In terms of upfront costs, I think the important thing to remember is that when we're talking about shifting to clean heat, we're trying to ensure that we're really comparing the cost of a first installation of a heat pump or other low-carbon heating solution with a replacement of a gas boiler. We think over time, lifetime costs of a new installation of a heat pump can come into line with a replacement gas boiler if we're able to reduce running costs fairly significantly, which heat pumps give you the opportunity to do because they're so much more efficient. We'll still need to subsidise upfront costs for low-income and vulnerable households, I think. But for wealthier consumers, I think subsidies can be phased out over time. And we'd recommend government look at introducing low-cost loans to support able-to-pay households to manage costs over time. We also expect to see upfront costs coming down over time. We can see innovation in the sector, for example, around reducing the time it takes to do parts of the installation process, such as heat loss surveying. So I think there's a range of ways in which upfront costs can come down and running costs can come down, both through cheaper electricity and through improved efficiency.
Thanks. I know you've done a lot of work on what clean heat kind of technology should kind of play a part. I wonder whether you could say a bit more about what, you know, the role of hydrogen or not, the role of heat pumps, district heat networks. And I know you've also published some work on the gas grid, so I'd be interested to know a bit about your views on that, because obviously there's issues around if there's quite a substantial take-up of heat pumps, that does pose questions around the future of the gas grid, as your research highlighted. Could you say a bit more about those things?
Yeah, I'll say both of those. So, as I've said at the start, we're a charity whose goal is to cut carbon emissions from homes. And when we started this work, we looked at the various different pathways to decarbonisation. And our firm view is that electrification is the most feasible, viable, and overall will be the lowest cost way to decarbonise homes. That is primarily because electric technologies can be so much more efficient than anything else. And we think heat pumps are likely to be the key technology because of their enhanced efficiency. They won't be the only technology. There are other electric technologies out there. There may even be a niche case for hydrogen, but effectively electrification is the main route to decarbonising homes. When it comes to hydrogen, it's hard to see how that can be practical given the cost of hydrogen. I think we don't yet have very much hydrogen at all, let alone low-carbon hydrogen. I think the government's first allocation round for electrolytic hydrogen saw a strike price of something like £240 per megawatt hour. I mean, that would have to come down very significantly for hydrogen to really have any role in decarbonisation. It needs to have some role, let alone hydrogen for heat. And we know that using hydrogen for home heating is an inefficient use of that fuel and also of green electricity. It would take about 5 to 6 times more green electricity to produce electrolytic hydrogen to heat homes than to use that green electricity to heat homes directly with heat pumps. So it's hard for us to see a big role for hydrogen in home heating. As I said, there may be some niche cases around industrial clusters, for example. But our strong view at Nesta is that uncertainty actually needs to be closed down. We don't know what further evidence government needs to be able to take its decision on the role of hydrogen in the grid, but we do know that the lack of a decision is slowing decarbonisation attempts in a number of ways, simply because consumers, installers and others don't have the certainty they need to move forward. In terms of the gas grid decommissioning, I guess an implication of moving to net zero by 2050 is that we won't be using methane gas to heat homes, and if we're not also using hydrogen, then we will need a much smaller gas grid. And I think the issue we're facing is that we don't have a plan for gas grid decommissioning at the moment, and it's not going to get any cheaper the longer we leave that. We need to start planning for the future of the gas grid, thinking about how costs will be managed. They could be quite significant. I know the National Infrastructure Commission estimated them anywhere between 25 billion and 75 billion. We won't be able to load them all onto bill payers, in my view, and I think you pick up the point about defection, as it were, so people moving off the gas grid and no longer paying for its upkeep through their energy bills. That could become quite a big issue if people do start taking up low carbon heat in large numbers, and we need to think how that can be managed. It's not practical to put all those costs onto electricity bills, but that would have a counterproductive effect. So we don't have an answer on that at Nesta, but we would recommend government look at that as soon as possible. And also just to point out that I think Nuclear Decommissioning Fund was set up something like 30 years ahead of actually decommissioning plants, so it was possible to start collecting that funding in a way that we knew it would be needed in future. We don't have anything like that for the gas grid at the moment, and we do need it.
Thanks very much. I guess I'd open that same question out to Andy and Mike. So what the combined questions really kind of what are the measures needed to accelerate clean heat in households across the country, and your views on the balance between heat pumps and the role of heat pumps and hydrogen and other forms within the...
I agree with Madeleine in terms of the deterrence at the moment for moving to a low carbon technology is the upfront cost. That's clear in all of the studies that have been undertaken on that, and for the benefit of the committee, for the boiler upgrade scheme, heat pump installs, it's running at £13,200 compared to about £2,500 for a straight boiler replacement. So the gulf between the two is great, and clearly that is going to be the major deterrence, and that was confirmed by officials at DESNES when they gave evidence to the Public Accounts Committee earlier this year. That's their view as well. It's also true that at the moment running costs for a heat pump typically are more expensive than a gas boiler, and that's not an incentive if you want to move down the route of suggesting heat pumps are the panacea or the way forward to decarbonise heat. Where we disagree with Nesta, firstly, we're wary of the rebalancing argument. Our members will always point to this. They'll say the reason why we can't sell heat pumps in the UK is what they call the spark gap. The difference between the unit price of gas and electricity is too great compared to the rest of Europe. But when we look at what is required on a purely economic financial basis to make a heat pump competitive with a replacement of a gas boiler in terms of the upfront cost and the running cost combined, the amount that you would have to rebalance by is astronomical in terms of what you would have to do to make it work for a reduction of electricity price. You'd have to basically take 10 pence off the current unit price of electricity. If you wanted to rebalance it by making gas more expensive, it puts the gas price up, if you've got the availability of the boiler upgrade scheme to every household. It puts the gas price up to 9p a kilowatt. That's a 50% increase. If you can't afford the boiler upgrade scheme to every household, it goes up to 15.5p on gas. So I would urge strong caution about rebalancing by putting it on, moving electricity levies onto gas, because of the consequential social policy implications that might have on things like fuel poverty. Using taxation is then seen as the other route by which you can rebalance, so the policy costs come off direct taxation rather than moving on to gas. And again, it's about the availability. How much money is the Treasury willing to pay towards this scheme? The boiler upgrade scheme, making it available at £7,500 a time to the 23 million houses currently on the gas grid, that's £173 billion. In terms of the annual support that you would need to subsidise electricity...
Sorry, but if I may, we do need to compare it against the other scenario of hydrogen rather than just gas.
Absolutely. I'm just urging caution on the rebalancing argument that it's not necessarily going to shift the dial in the way that some advocates claim. In terms of where we see the pathway going forward, we think it's a mixture of heat pumps, heat networks, and hydrogen boilers going forward. The exact proportion, we don't have a firm view on what that should be. It should very much be about the individual homes, what they're constructed of, where they are located. Industrial clusters, for example, would be a sensible use of hydrogen. Putting a heat pump into a solid wall property would not be a sensible use of a heat pump as a technology. So it's very much an individual property led decision going forward, where we would also disagree on just what Madeleine said. We don't think talk about hydrogen is somehow dissuading people from putting in a heat pump. And indeed, I point to the very research that Nesta conducted that concluded the talk of hydrogen had no bearing whatsoever on people's decision to buy or not a heat pump.
Mike, can I just ask you this? The UK ranked 21st out of 21 neighbouring countries for per capita installations of heat pumps in 2022. We've seen falling installations of heat pumps in this country. Why are other countries able to do so much better?
Firstly, we're comparing different energy infrastructures across Europe. So there aren't many countries that have got the extended gas grid that we have got. So we have used gas boilers typically as a way to heat our homes. But what I would say, Mr. Esterson, is what's happening in Europe is not a good story. In 2023, heat pump sales in Europe fell. In 2024, for the first 3 quarters, compared to 2023, Belgium is down 47%, France down 44%, Germany down 52%, Netherlands down 43%, and Poland down 55%. The heat pump technology is expensive whether you live in Europe or whether you live in the United Kingdom, and that's something that needs to be addressed across the board if we're to use that technology to decarbonise.
In 2022, in France, there were 462,000 sales of heat pumps. There were 59,000 in this country. It's dropped in this country since then. So they were doing so much. But anyway, I'm going to move on to Madeleine and ask the same question.
Yeah, I mean, could I come back on a couple of points Mike made? No one is suggesting that you try and levelise the lifetime costs of heat pumps and boilers purely through rebalancing energy bills, and that's a complete straw man argument. The proposal that we're putting forward is that there is some rebalancing from electricity to gas while supporting low-income and fuel-poor households who may lose out as a result of that. That actually produces a fairer allocation of levies, which at the moment are disproportionately on electricity bills, which really disadvantages some consumers who are in fuel poverty, namely those who are on direct electric heating, severely disadvantages those. There are a number of ways that you can bring lifetime costs to parity. They will not all be achieved through balancing energy bills. So I just really wanted to point that out. The other point that Mike raised was around right technology, right place. But the example you used of putting a heat pump in a solid wall property is very easy to disprove. We have loads of heat pumps already in solid wall properties. In fact, the highest performing heat pump that we can see on where people have shared data openly about their heat pump performance is in a solid wall property built somewhere between 1900 and 1920. So we can do it. I just wanted to point that out. In terms of numbers, my understanding of European heat pump uptake is that it is on an upward trajectory, but that there was a peak year in 2022 related to the gas price crisis and people's response to that, where buying a heat pump was seen as a way of sort of counterintuitive, shall we say. Overall, the trajectory is upwards. What happens in Europe, though, is that different technologies are used, and I think it would be worth us thinking about the role of other heat pump technologies here more than we already do. So we see a lot of air-to-air heat pumps going in Germany and France, and we don't really use those very much here. So that I think there's lots that we can learn from Europe, but at the same time we have different housing stock.
I'm conscious I've interrupted Luke Murphy's questioning.
I mean, I would I've got one more question, but I wanted to hear I'm keen to hear from Andy as well.
Yeah, look, well, thanks. And I think, look, from a starting position, I'm sat here as a representative of around 30,000 gas-safe engineers out of the 100,000 that currently work in this country. These people work in every constituency, in every town, village and city across the country. They are well-paid, highly skilled individuals, and they have been carrying the backbone of this country's heating needs for the last well over a century. And what concerns me for a start is that, I don't think that they have largely featured in the debate, other than via some highly optimistic, if not borderline fantastical ideas of what a just transition can look like. So I am sitting here unashamedly from a worker's perspective on this. And what concerns me on sort of aside from this is what we're looking at is a macro issue which we're expecting to be dealt with almost at a level of an individual choice and house per house. So this is ultimately, if you look at where the one successful just transition we've had as a country, is when we moved from town gas, which ironically was majority hydrogen, to North Sea gas in the 60s and 70s, which was a process that was delivered by a nationalised industry. It was delivered on time and under budget, and effectively involved 22 million appliances being changed in 13 million houses on a house-by-house, street-by-street process. That was managed under national agreements by trade unions, employers and government, and ultimately helped deliver that. Now, what concerns me is that when we look at a lot of what we believe is happening, we're sitting here and arguing about individual choices on heat pumps, where actually there is a longer situation where we need to say, well, what does heating look like in this country? Now, if you take the Climate Change Committee, they've talked about a slight majority. Now, first point I should declare, we are extremely sceptical of the Climate Change Committee. On a recent discussion with them, we found that all of their targets are national, which means that they are perversely incentivising offshoring, which we would argue does not help. But the second point is, even when you look at their figures on 2050, we're talking about a potential of 52% of homes on having heat pumps, 42% on district heating, and 5% on hydrogen boilers. Now, if you take the district heating position, which we all believe is going to be a major factor in terms of decarbonisation in the future, that is only going to be applicable into certain geographical areas. And yet what we're doing at the moment is we're firing out large subsidies on heat pumps, which, if you look at where these subsidies are being granted, they're being granted overwhelmingly to some of the richest parts of the country. And there's a real danger here that we are currently incentivising the uptake of heat pumps in areas which will shortly go to district heating. And what we believe needs to happen is, rather than have this kind of individual, each person making a decision on their own merits, we need to have a national plan of what we believe heating is going to look like, to give people certainty, both in terms of a consumer and, more important from my point, as a workforce, in being able to talk confidently about the skills that are going to be needed in different parts of the country to deliver the technologies. We see that there is a potential big role for hydrogen, accepting that there are challenges at the moment in price. But there's also other technologies such as hybrid boilers. They have the potential to cut emissions by 80% while reducing customer bills. And what concerns me about this debate is we're letting the perfect get in the way of the good. We have a real opportunity to decarbonise quickly, and instead we're reliant on something that requires a massive grid expansion at exactly the same time as we're looking at a huge increase in the number of data centres, electric arc furnaces, transport. There is simply not the capacity to deliver this. So we need to get back to that national plan, back with an industrial strategy that gives us that long-term certainty, instead, frankly, of throwing out subsidies left, right and centre without any clear idea of where we're going on them.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to move on to... Sorry, Luke. No. We've already had double the time for this. Polly Billington, please.
Thank you, Chair. I was actually just going to go back to the incentivising of the electrification of heat, although I'm very interested in something Andy said, and I'd probably like to follow that up in a bit. Madeleine, how do you think the government should approach rebalancing that gas and electricity price? Because you said part of the problem is that we know this straight away. If you just put the carbon cost on gas, while like most people use gas, and particularly the fuel poor use gas, that's going to be a problem. What, once you've had a think about and explained what your approach would be, what impact would this have on the rollout of electric heat technologies? Because I'm very interested in Andy's point about that kind of strategic planning of this, so that you have not got this kind of consumer choice thing, which is scattergun and unhelpful in the long term.
Yeah, I'll pick up both of those points. Also on levies, what we've actually done, published today in fact, is look at a really wide range of rebalancing scenarios, right through to taking all of the levies off electricity and putting them into general taxation, through to putting them all onto gas and everything in between. And we've looked at the impact that would have on 24 consumer archetype groups. So they're the consumer groups that Ofgem uses in its analysis. And we know what the average energy spend is for those 24 groups and a lot about their characteristics. So we can look at the distributional impacts effectively of different scenarios for rebalancing. We haven't come out with a strong recommendation yet because this is an interim report. But essentially our view is that the best approach that sort of maximises the different objectives you might have for rebalancing is to partially rebalance, by which I mean move some of the levies from electricity to gas while supporting low-income and vulnerable consumers who might lose out as a result, who might see their gas bills going up a bit. This seems to be, to me, the most pragmatic way to do it, that both reduces that electricity-gas price ratio, the spark gap that Mike mentioned, in a way that would meaningfully incentivise electrification while protecting those who most need protection, and we really do need to do that. It's really very, very important. In terms of impact on gas bills for other consumers, obviously that is a sensitive issue, but where you're looking at wealthier consumer groups who might see their gas bills going up £5 or £10 a year, it might not be the highest consideration. So we think there are ways to do it that are likely to be politically acceptable, do achieve decarbonisation goals, and do protect consumers. Except there's trade-offs in that. But I think, at the moment, I do want to point out that the distribution of levies at the moment is not rational or fair. It's the result of legacy decisions about how to fund decarbonisation schemes and schemes to upgrade homes. And it does leave quite a lot of people in a significantly bad situation if they're using direct electric heating. So it addresses some of that unfairness while achieving several goals simultaneously, we think. In terms of the national plan, I really agree with Andy on that. I think we do need much more strategic planning about the future of heat. I think that can happen at several different levels. So I think we need a national plan, but we also see the development of regional energy planning under the new NESO and the regional energy strategic plans. We would like to see more detailed planning at a local level. In Wales and Scotland, local authorities are all doing a version of local area energy planning. In England, it's much patchier, and we think there's something more granular needed that would look at really the sort of the heat transition in those areas, and where you will have heat networks and where individual home solutions are going to be more likely. I'd probably disagree with Andy's point that people are choosing heat pumps in areas that will have district heating in future. At the moment, given where we see heat pumps going in, but I do accept it's a risk if we don't have a plan, and I think that's really important because we hear from consumers that they really, one of the questions they have is, are they making the wrong choice? If they do something now, we
don't know where the heat network is going to be. That's the problem. So people are buying it, possibly, and then they might find that they've actually bet the farm on the wrong kind of technology for their location.
Yeah, and I think that's why we are progressing on heat network zoning, and I think that will really help. I think there is still some uncertainty because even if you are in a heat network zone, you don't necessarily know whether your house is going to be able to connect and when. That's something we're doing some research on. How do you talk to people about the future of heat in an area in a way that gives them some confidence about the right decision to make? I think my understanding of the CCC's projections of the future of heat were that district heating would play a slightly smaller role than Andy said, but I don't have those figures to hand. I thought it was somewhere more on the 20% of heating in the future. And I think that's also what government working assumption is. I think that individual home solutions are likely to be more common than district heating. although we are also seeing innovation in things like shared ground loops that support individual ground source heat pumps in homes, and I think we might see more collective solutions like that. I think maybe where we'd agree is that we at Nesta are really interested in how you might support whole areas to shift to low carbon heat at once, whether that's through shared infrastructure like heat networks or ground loops, or whether it's through individual solutions in homes. But we think that could help both speed up the transition, give people more confidence because they can see some of their neighbours are doing this as well, take some of the work off people, all the research you have to do as a homeowner or householder to work out what solution's right for you, and potentially reduce costs through economies of scale. And we're looking at ways that could be delivered locally.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the point about policy costs on consumer bills. I'd just like to ask everybody, would you support the removal of policy costs from consumer electricity bills? And if so, where should the costs be paid from? I mean, Madeleine said that you've got that research. One of the options is taxation. What are the other options that you would consider, Mike and Andy?
I mean, Madeleine's right there. It's a legacy issue. Frankly, some of the policy costs around things like eco would put on electricity bills because they didn't want to come out of taxation. That was a political decision at the time. Therefore, it would be a political decision to move them from electricity bills to general taxation. That would be the fairest route, without doubt, in terms of having them paid. So that was what we have. But we would just urge extreme caution about increasing the unit price of gas to rebalance levies. We do not think it will be sufficient to be the justification for the incentive to switch from one technology to another, because the gulf in terms of running costs and the payback required from the initial investment is so great that you would need huge amounts to be transferred from electricity to gas. And the impact, as I've said before, the social impact on fuel poverty for those who are less able to pay, less able to afford to make the switch, would be pretty awful for an awful lot of people in the country. One point I would just pick up on from what Madeleine said around the costs of appliances coming down and how that might have an impact on these things. There are 3 million heat pumps sold in Europe at the moment. There's about 70,000-ish sold in the UK at the moment. You could double UK sales overnight and you wouldn't alter the cost of the actual appliance. There will be some reduction of cost in terms of installation, and I think that needs to be worked on, because that can have a bearing about how much we're talking about in terms of rebalancing. But the differential at the moment is so great that I suggest we need to look at all options to have them on the table, so that hybrids, as Andy said, absolutely viable option going forward that wouldn't necessarily involve the rebalancing of costs, because we'll be looking at a heat pump and a boiler working together to deliver an 80% decarbonisation of a home, and that is better than no decarbonisation, because people can't afford to make that initial leap.
Luke, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but it's not just the CCC or Nesta, the National Infrastructure Commission, and a review of independent studies on the future of heat ruled out hydrogen as a significant contributor to low carbon heat. Now, I don't dispute what Andy was saying around the impact on jobs and the need for a national strategic plan, but a national strategic plan also does imply making some choices. And I would just, I wonder why it is that so many independent studies, the CCC, the National Infrastructure Commission, and all of these organisations, and that study on the 50 independent excluded those by heat pump manufacturers and boiler manufacturers in order to come to kind of an independent assessment. Why is it that they all rule out hydrogen as having a significant role in the heating of homes? I'd be interested in answers from everyone on that.
Some of those studies were based on overseas infrastructures, overseas countries, which are not necessarily applicable and easily translatable to the UK. So those also need to be ruled out. If I picked on the Climate Change Committee initial report, they also put forward a pathway to reach net zero by 2050 that it included a large amount of homes being heated by hydrogen boilers. It was just not their preferred scenario. There is a route to do it, but it wasn't their preferred scenario. And as for the National Infrastructure Commission, where they suggested effectively decommissioning the gas distribution network. If I took Basingstoke as an example, I mean, that's 34,761 domestic properties. It's 624 commercial properties. It's 175 industrial connections, all of which currently come off the distribution gas network. In addition, the gas distribution network provides electricity backup for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. It would mean getting rid of that at the very time when we need more of it. The gas distribution network also is the point at which biomethane is injected into the gas grid to displace the use of natural gas. There's 124 sites currently putting biomethane into the gas distribution network. This is the network that the National Infrastructure wanted to get rid of.
I'm not sure this answers the question as to why the National Infrastructure Commission and all those other studies have come to that same conclusion. And they have come to the same conclusion around the costs of hydrogen and the difficulties in producing the levels of green hydrogen and the level of electricity required in order to produce that green hydrogen. I'd be interested, Madeleine and Andy, in your views. Madeleine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those studies are fairly clear. I mean, I've already mentioned the high cost of hydrogen, which you also reference. We simply don't have green hydrogen at the moment. The government, in that first allocation round that I mentioned, only procured, I think, sort of 1.5 gigawatts out of a total sort of targeted 10 of electrolytic hydrogen. We can't make enough quickly enough to decarbonise our homes. At the same time, when you look at things like the cost of the network costs of electrification on their own are cheaper than the network costs of having an upgraded electricity grid and a gas grid converted to hydrogen. The whole system costs, according to the NIC, are cheaper in an electrification-only scenario. Switching to hydrogen also, it's often talked about as a simple option, the coordination being simpler, and there is some merit to that in the sense that people are used to gas boilers, and we've done, as Andy mentioned, a transition of gas boilers before, but it's not without its difficulties. I mean, that does mean if you're going to switch over methane to hydrogen in the gas grid, you literally then have to switch everyone at once. And yes, we've done that once before, but the coordination is very, very difficult. We just don't have the capacity to produce green hydrogen at the scale we would need to heat homes, and that, I think, is the conclusion of those studies.
Yeah, we're going to have to move on. So can we hear Andy, your answer to that? And we need to go back to Polly for the next set of questions.
Look, I don't pretend to be a scientific expert, and my grade D GCSE does go some way to explain that. But I think when we're looking at this, I remember it was only 15 years ago that everyone talked routinely about wind power being the most expensive there was, and it was being completely uneconomical and no one was going to support it, and that was 15 years ago. Huge investment brought the price down significantly, and what we're seeing with hydrogen is we know it has to have massive industrial use because it's the only way we can power those blast furnaces. And what we're saying is when we know that investment has to go into hydrogen, does that give us some scope to see if the costs come down? The second point is the one thing hydrogen does allow you to do is rebalance the grid. So currently significant amounts of energy is lost every night when they have to turn off the wind power from the grid because that's nowhere to go. The theory is that you use that at night to fill the likes of the Rough gas storage site, which is the largest in Europe, and then you use it during the day. I also think you have to look at this, and too often we're looking at the costs in one way. So the costs on one level is what is the cost of hydrogen through the grid. The second is what is the cost of decommissioning a gas network while significantly increasing the amount of electrification. And if you look at electrification, we are, several nuclear sites have had their life extended in the last couple of days, but by 2030 we're losing a huge amount of nuclear capacity. At the same point, there's a huge expansion in the amount of energy needed. And the real concern, and we've been talking to cable manufacturers, their entire stock is sold out for the next decade. So even if we want to do this at the speed we seek to do, there is likely to be a lack of infrastructure to support a transition at the speed we want to do it. And what concerns me is that we're potentially going to have a massive kickback from many people who feel they're being thrown out of work, that they're being given less options. And let's be honest, we've seen this in America. America, if we sat here last year, we would have been talking about how successful IRA was, how it was delivering that change. One election, every single thing is out the window. And if we don't take people with us, if we don't take communities with us and leave people thinking this is being done to them, then we risk being able to achieve absolutely nothing. and that's what I would caution.
Mr. Edison, could
Probably, no, sorry, we do need to move on because we've got a lot of questions.
It's okay. My questions are on the future of the gas network anyway, so we'll
you carry on that.
deep on this one.
You have another 6 minutes on this.
Yeah, marvellous. Looking forward to it. No, it is actually on like if we're expecting them to install those heat pumps. I hear what you say, Andy. There are a number of sort of assumptions in there, but as most households are expected to either install heat pumps or go into heat networks, is it time for us to think about how we go about decommissioning or repurposing that gas network? Who would bear the cost? And I mean, costs also mean that there's jobs in there. So I mean, I'm interested to know what this would look like from your perspective in terms of decommissioning or repurposing the gas network.
I mean, I'd willing to start happily on this. In terms of the decision, I would say, look, this is such a big decision for the UK to take. It's 284,000 kilometres of pipe that we're talking about. Really, you could do a whole select committee hearing just on that one topic. And frankly, we know that, didn't you, Mike? Well, we know ministers and officials are thinking about this, as they should be, and therefore it would be an appropriate topic going forward as to actually how would you go about decommissioning a gas network or repurposing a gas network. And at that point, if I can, I'll just pick up a couple of comments about the price of hydrogen, because that is absolutely relevant to how you repurpose the gas network. When studies have been done by the Energy Networks Association and by Cornwall Insight, they've spoken about the price of green hydrogen at about 6p a kilowatt to the consumer. We're currently paying 6.24 pence a kilowatt for our natural gas. So in terms of the price to the consumer, by 2030, we actually can be comparable with where we are now. Now, it's higher than historic levels of gas prices, but compared to where we are now, it's on par. And the point that Andy made about where do we get the hydrogen from if we're going to repurpose the network, well, we currently paid, last year it was £1 billion in curtailment fees to not use the wind power that we generated. Much better to use that excess wind to produce something that is useful, i.e. green hydrogen. And the more we develop our wind infrastructure to meet the Clean Power 2030 target, the more we are going to have surplus wind capacity when we don't need it.
Bearing in mind the other decarbonisation challenges we've got on industry, on transport and so forth, where green hydrogen would be a solution, why would we think that actually using this for heat is the best and most efficient do? Royal Society of Chemistry suggests it's 5 times more expensive than current natural gas prices, and CCC says that hydrogen will be 7 times less efficient than renewables to power heat pumps. So why would we do that?
I mean, first of all, I would say green hydrogen is not the only form of hydrogen that would be available.
No, but the others are not very carbon light, are they?
Well, with carbon capture and storage, which is something that this government has earmarked funding for, then yes, it is a way in which you can develop low carbon hydrogen, and the same would be true for pink hydrogen from nuclear if that was something that was being considered. So there are roles around hydrogen that need to be worked out, and where the priority should be, as Andy said, it should be primarily on industry first, because we will not be able to decarbonise industry without hydrogen in many sectors. The problem we have is that not all of the industry that we use and we rely on for jobs and rely on for goods is located in industrial clusters that can be easily earmarked for a conversion to hydrogen.
Well, yeah,
they're in each and every constituency in the land.
Focus back here, which is about heating people's homes. And what we would do about where the cost would go on decommissioning and repurposing the heat network, which at the moment obviously is directed for the gas network, which is predominantly directed towards heating people's homes. What would we do about those costs?
The same pipes are the ones that service the homes, that service the industry. I mean, that's the point about the gas distribution network. They service homes, they service industry. And if you're going to put hydrogen through to service the industry in your constituencies, then all of those homes nearby potentially have a route to decarbonise. I'm not saying it's true for every home. We believe in a mixed blend of technologies, but actually to deprive people of accessing what could be a cheaper option for them, that would be a mistake in our view. So it's that broad
you don't accept the CCC's assessment of the cost of of hydrogen.
I accept that the current cost of hydrogen is not one that would be suitable for the market, but we're not talking about now, we're talking about where we're going to be in 2030 and where we're going to be in 2050. And all the expectations are that the costs of green hydrogen are going to come down. The Joe Biden moonshot project spoke about $1 a kilo for hydrogen. Europe is looking for $2 a kilo. That is very price competitive with the current price of natural gas. And if those are the targets that are being set for other parts of the world, why would we want to lock ourselves in or believe that we're suddenly going to be in a very expensive hydrogen economy? We're going to be competitive with other parts of the world. And in terms of, why would the CCC say that? Well, perhaps because they are modelers, it fits with their assessment of where the country's going to go, what they believe the country's going to go in terms of domestic home heating.
Well, can I move on to the reformed clean heat market mechanism? Because that's a market mechanism, therefore, ostensibly some kind of technology neutral. Does this go far enough to encourage the development of clean heat supply chains, which is one of the key things we've been talking about, without penalising those who remain on the gas network?
No, the clean heat market mechanism was a bad policy when the previous government had it. It's a bad policy now. It's better than it was, as your letter yesterday pointed out. A £500 fine for missing a target is a lot better than a £5,000 fine for missing the target. But that fine would have just been passed on to the consumer. So the consumers would have paid the penalty for householders not putting a heat pump in their home. The issue is not about the supply of heat pumps. You could go to Screwfix or Plumbase and pick up a heat pump tomorrow. That's not the problem. The problem is the demand for heat pumps. And all the clean heat market mechanism tried to do was to increase the supply of heat pumps, when actually that's not the problem. People who make heat pumps have got warehouses with heat pumps in. As I say, you could buy tomorrow. It's the demand for heat pumps that's the issue that needs addressing.
Before you ask your final question in this session, we have 19 minutes till the vote, and we have 3 more questions to go. So
I'll leave it then.
Yeah. Happy with that. Great. Thank you.
Let's go.
Thank you very much. Claire, you're next, please.
Yes. So we're going to go back to the questions around retrofit and the range of financial options available. So firstly, a question for all of you is the government doing enough to provide consumers an attractive range of financial options? And then following on from that, are the grant values under programmes such as the boiler upgrade scheme enough to ensure that all households can afford to install heat pumps, not just those with the ability to pay?
Can start on that. In terms of financial options, the boiler upgrade scheme is there, in my view, to stimulate the market, to get early adopters adopting heat pumps more quickly. It wouldn't be sustainable at that level if every household got a heat pump, that's clear. Our view at Nesta is that it can be reduced over time as things like the efficiency of heat pump installations goes up, as hopefully the price of electricity comes down, as we get economies of scale in the actual delivery of heat pumps themselves, which should bring down upfront cost. In terms of what else government could be doing to support consumers with cost, we think low-cost loans are something that government should look at, because our view is probably over time the way that most people will pay for a heat transition is through finance. That's how most people buy cars, for example. It's a very common way of dealing with big upfront purchases. The cost of finance is really salient in terms of the cost of going over to low-carbon heat, and we've estimated that every 1% on an interest rate pushes up the cost of converting all homes to low-carbon heating by 9 billion. So if you can bring down the cost of finance, you're saving individual consumers a lot of money and making the whole transition a lot cheaper. And it would be really good to look at government-backed loans. We've done some work with the Development Bank of Wales on the role of government-backed loans, found quite a lot of support amongst the population for that idea, and the Welsh Development Bank has recently introduced a retrofit loan. It'd be really interesting to learn from that and its take-up to see how that could be applied in England. So finance is the main reason, main incentive that I think we need to look at, and there's also plenty of scope in working with, say, mortgage lenders to look at how they can support their customers to upgrade their homes. I'm interested in the stamp duty rebate proposal that was mentioned in the previous session as well. I'll just mention one other thing, because if we're talking about government support for heat pump uptake at the moment, it's important to recognise that about as many heat pumps are being supported through schemes like ECO as the boiler upgrade scheme at the moment. So government funding is going to households at both ends of the income spectrum. And in terms of bus uptake, Andy's right to say that it is skewed towards richer constituencies, but we also see uptake in all constituencies, and some of the highest uptake is in constituencies that are to the lower end of the IMD scale. So it's not the case that it's only richer areas that are taking this up. We don't know the actual characteristics of the households that are taking up bus.
Just bring Bradley Thomas in for a question, because I think you indicated.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think you've sort of touched upon this a little bit already, moving away from loans and thinking about fiscal levers. Any view on any other levers beyond stamp duty? For instance, in Italy, at one point in not so distant past, they had, I think it was a 110% tax rebate for consumers who installed heat pumps.
That's really interesting. My understanding of the Italian scheme is that it didn't work very well in the end and was stopped early. I think in terms of fiscal uptake, fiscal levers, the other ones that we've looked at really are around energy bills and whether there's any case for example, reducing VAT on energy bills. We don't currently propose that. We think it's interesting to look at, but we don't have a recommendation on it. Potentially carbon price floor, which is pushing up the price of gas-generated electricity, may have reached the end of its useful life. So we could look, there maybe are other fiscal levers, but we don't have a strong view on those.
I mean, following on from what Madeleine said about low-cost loans, it's very similar to the scheme that was employed by the previous government, the Green Deal, which was a failure. Primarily because the interest rate, I think it was about 7%, was far too high compared to the market interest rate at the time. But that was the rate at which finance was being made available by financiers. So the only way to do it, if you're going to retrofit a building, it's got to be a very, very competitive rate of interest to be attractive to the householder. And if that's the carrot, what will be the stick? And when you start to introduce a stick, then you become politically unpopular, and that's something that you around this table would need to be more aware of than me. On the boiler upgrade scheme, the scheme is designed to only be accessible by those who are relatively well off. The average figure under the upgrade scheme at the moment is $13,200 per installation. If you're granted $7,500, that's $5,700 a householder has to fund themselves. There aren't many people who A, have that at their disposal, and B, would be willing then to use it to fund a change in their heating system. In terms of geographically where it's being spread, there are some interesting features that are coming out. St Ives, for example, as a constituency, has had 353 installations of the boiler upgrade scheme in that constituency, against Knowsley that's at 18. We could look at North Devon at 243 against Sefton 30. It's quite clear where these heat pumps under the boiler upgrade scheme are going, and I'd probably vouch there were probably more holiday homes in Cornwall receiving the boiler upgrade scheme than there were people in Knowsley and Sefton.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Having mentioned, I'm sorry, we ran out of time. Having mentioned Sefton, I shall resist the temptation to ask the next question. I shall ask Annalise Midgley to ask one, because you mentioned Knowsley. I think you're on workforce.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to refer to my declaration of interest. I'm also a member of the GMB. I'd like to ask about workforce skills and jobs, primarily for Andy. So evidence taken by a predecessor committee was sceptical of the preparedness of our workforce and warned of a twin crises underlying the sector of lack. So they cited lack of new entrants and a rapidly ageing workforce. There's other stakeholders who said that grants to retrain weren't enough to encourage workers to take time off the tools. I was interested in the point that you made earlier about national plan rather than individual incentives and subsidies, with the workforce at the heart of that. So I'm going to squeeze 3 questions into this initial thing and see where we get to. Do you think the workforce are properly and fairly incentivised to take time off the tools and work to retrain on low carbon heating technologies? What do you think the government need to do to make sure we've got a prepared workforce needed to carry out the retrofitting of our homes? And do you think that the government is putting enough in place to make sure that we've got a just transition for workers operating in this particular sector?
Right, well, just in terms of those, and they're three very good questions. The first, one of the problems we have with this industry has been, as in many, the massive increase in casualisation since the 1970s. So when the previous one was done, this was largely an employed model, where ultimately by getting agreements with large employers, we would ultimately upskill the workforce. What we now have is that while there are still some large employers in terms of employers of gas-safe engineers, huge numbers of them, and the overall majority, are either sole traders or work with very, very small establishments. So in terms of the costs and what is being offered at the moment, you're looking at a £500 grant to do a course which is often significantly more than that, which will take you off the tools for 3 or 4 days. So you're asking people to give up often several thousands of pounds to do a course in a skill which they are routinely not asked to undertake. And one of the big issues, I think most of us who have done training on Monday is fantastic for what you're going to do on Tuesday. Yeah. Training on Monday for what you may be doing in 2.5 years' time is absolutely useless. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the real difficulties, that what we're asking people to do is give up time and money in order to meet a need which often doesn't exist in their particular area. And the fact that we are doing this via sort of sole traders and small enterprises means it's far harder for this to be managed in the way it was beforehand. I look after British Gas, for example. We will be talking to British Gas, and it's very common for us to talk about workforce upskilling. I think virtually every job in the country, if you look at a building site now, it's very different than it was 30 years ago. There's an expectation amongst most people about upskilling. And when you look at the gas workforce, these people have to be reaccredited every few years to make sure their skills. So these are not people who aren't used to going back to college, but what we're asking them to do is spend a lot of money and lose a lot over something that there is no demand for. I think in terms of the second question, it comes back to that point beforehand, which has to be a plan. And I think the real concern here is that we're asking people to support a government initiative which may not last, which they at the moment is delivering little in the way of work, and which a lot of them simply don't have confidence in. And when you add that to demographic challenges, if you have an engineer in his early 20s, you're obviously far more incentivised than if you are in your late 50s, early 60s, where you're probably going to sit there and just say, I'm going to sit it out. The final point around kind of the just transition is, and this is a point we make everywhere, it's a lovely phrase that gets thrown around all of the time. And frankly, our ability of managing change in this level is next to non-existent. Most just transitions have not been just transitions, they have simply been transitions. We saw it with a move away from coal, you've seen it in lots and lots of industries. My granddad was a compositor, used to employ hundreds of thousands of people, now rarer than hen's teeth. So I think firstly we need a plan. Secondly, we need to address some of the underlying issues. And the simple problem we have, and look, some of the questions asked about, well, do we force gas engineers to do this? Well, the reality is a gas engineer is a skilled job, is a hard job to get into. You have to do an apprenticeship, or you have to, either paid for by an employer, which means low wages for a period of time while you train, or doing it off your own back and your own cost. A lot of people fail that because it's a difficult process to go through. It's a skilled job, it's a responsible job, and ultimately it's an accredited job. What we're doing is talking about A, making that harder for people to qualify, and B, when they do qualify, heat pump engineers get paid on average about £10,000 less than gas engineers. So you'll forgive me if it doesn't sound like the most enticing prospect, train harder to get less. And I think we have to look at that. And we have to address the fact of the fragmentation of the industry. We have to come up with a national viable plan with cross-party support that gives us some idea of what the future looks like. And we have to recognise that these people exist in every constituency. They put money in the economy. On every estate is normally the gas engineer who is one of the best paid people there. We have to protect these people and make sure that they're at the vanguard of any change and not simply an afterthought, which is too often what it feels like at the moment.
Right, thank you very much for that. Well, I'm going to move on because we really are coming to the vote in a few minutes. And Bradley Thomas, you've got a few questions on
Okay,
yep.
Topic. So, a few questions. Has the government and standards bodies struck an effective balance between protecting consumers and enabling the workforce to operate without unnecessary burdens and bureaucracy? Do you think there should be more formal avenues for redress when home retrofit goes wrong? And what measures do you think government could take to ensure that rogue retrofitters can't operate in the sector?
I think there's been quite widespread agreement that there needs to be a shift in standards and how they're managed, from a focus on compliance to one focusing on performance, and also that the system needs to be simplified from a consumer perspective. There are reforms underway to the MCS scheme to do that, so one argument is to let those play out and see if they do improve the situation. We've also talked to Citizens Advice, who recommend potentially the introduction of a statutory redress scheme that would provide hand-holding and case support for those in really complex and vulnerable situations. So I think we'd all agree that that there do need to be some improvements in the way that standards are managed at the moment. There are some in train, and we can see how those pan out.
I mean, one of the things about the MCS scheme, which is the government recognised accreditation scheme for the low carbon technologies, is that it's not mandatory on all low carbon technology installations. If you want the government subsidy, then you have to go through an MCS scheme. If you fund it yourself, you don't. Well, that's not an incentive either to help installers train up and become installers of heat pumps if there is a limit to where they can operate. So we would advocate actually making it mandatory for MCS installations across the piece as a way of driving up standards of installations, because it's actually a good news story if you have a good low carbon technology product installed in your home. It's word of mouth gets around that these products can work and can work effectively. The one thing we would also think is a way forward is to bring forward mandatory annual servicing of all heating technologies. At the moment, if you're in the rented sector, you have an annual gas safety check. But what we should be looking to do is to have an annual service of your heating appliance, not just looking at the safety, but looking at how effectively and efficiently it is running for the consumer benefit. But also, and this is a key one in terms of any transition to alternative technologies, it will help identify the sweet spot at which point an old appliance becomes viable to be changed and not wait for that product to break down. The point it breaks down is the very worst time you could ask for to move to an alternative technology because of the delays involved in installing those products. So you want to identify a sweet spot where it's just before it breaks down so that you can manage the transition in an effective way, and we think a mandatory annual service is a way of doing that.
Right, well, thank you very much. Can I thank our second panel for your excellent evidence session, certainly very lively. I think we could have done a second hour with you quite easily. If there are additional points you want to make, this applies to the first panel as well, all our panels, please put them in writing to us. And with that, we will be adjourned for 15 minutes if it's one division, with 10 minutes extra for each further division if there is more than one. Order. Order, and welcome back to our session on the warm homes. Well, this bit will be on warm homes plan, because we have Minister Miatta, Fahnbulleh, and two officials with us for our third panel of the day. Perhaps if you could just introduce yourselves, Miatta first, if there's anything you want to say beyond what how I've just introduced you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chair. Miatta Fahnbulleh, Minister for Energy Consumers and DESNZ. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon.
Very much. And Olivia.
Thank you. I'm Olivia Haslam. I'm the Deputy Director for Net Zero Building Strategy in DESNZ. Thank you.
And Jessica.
Jessica Skilbeck. I'm one of the directors on the Net Zero Buildings portfolio in DESNZ.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for being here. We've heard a lot in writing. The previous committee in its inquiry heard a lot about the inadequacies of the various schemes, the complexities of them, and how that didn't help. What have you learned from the criticisms of the schemes you've inherited that will help you deliver effectively?
Look, very good question. And one of the advantages of coming in as a new government is that we can look at things in the round. And it's worth maybe just saying a word about why this scheme is so important to us as a department, why it's so important to our mission. You will know, as much as I do, that families across the country are still feeling the bite of the cost of living crisis. Energy is at the heart of that. And the truth is that for too many families, energy is simply unaffordable. In our analysis, that's a function of both, the fact that we have an over-reliance on global fossil fuel markets, and that's why our clean power mission is so critical. But it's also because, quite frankly, there was an abject failure over the last 15 years to upgrade enough homes and insulate people from price spikes. And so the Warm Homes Plan for us is absolutely imperative. I think the three things that we have taken away is, first, there's a scale question. We have an ambitious programme where we're trying to upgrade up to 5 million homes. That is a big lift on where we are at the moment. I think the second is that, schemes have been working well, but I think there is a kind of scale and an ability for us to persuade enough consumers to take up these programs to deliver the impact that we want to see across the country. And I think the third is that we have had examples where schemes have not delivered up to the standards that we would have liked, and there is a big bit of work that we are doing to understand why that is the case and think about how we reform existing schemes and future schemes to make sure that we are delivering quality interventions that consumers actually want and does the job of creating homes that are warmer and cheaper to run.
Right, well, that's a fantastic introduction. You mentioned 5 million homes over 5 years. Your first target is 300,000 in a year. I noticed that under the Great British Insulation Scheme, only 4,000 measures were delivered against a target, just coincidentally, of 300,000. How confident are you're going to be able to hit these targets, rising to 300,000 in 1 year and the 5 million over that 5 years?
Well, candidly, it is a big jump on where we are. We recognise that we've set ourselves a pretty ambitious target. And I think our judgment is some of the schemes, so GBs, for example, we are looking at reforms to that because it hasn't performed up to the level that we want. Our eco scheme has been much more successful, but none at the scale and quantum that we want. So I think there are three key things for us as we're thinking about how we deliver the uplift that we want to see. The first is on the demand side. There is a big job in winning hearts and minds of consumers, because in the end we can't force people to take on upgrades. We've got to persuade them that it is good for their pockets, that it's good for their home, it's good for their quality of life. I think the second part for us is making sure that we've got the supply chain and the workforce in order to deliver that upscale. And then there's a big delivery question. And one of the things that we're looking at is actually what's the scope for suppliers partnering with regional and local government, for example, to deliver area-based scaled interventions. And then you combine that with things like the minimum energy efficiency standard that we we announced in September and we're going to consult on, where we think, for example, that will deliver large interventions that would lift 1 million people out of fuel poverty. So yes, there is a step change, but we recognise that and we're putting in place a plan that we think can deliver that. It's not going to be easy, and there's a lot of work that we need to do across all those three measures, but I think we're quite clear-sighted about what needs to be done.
Yeah, thank you. I've been looking at the details that you've published so far, and there's quite a lot about social rented accommodation. Can you just sort of set out, we've heard in sessions already about the balance between social rented, private rented and owner-occupied. Can you just set out what the balances you would expect from that first 300,000 between those three types of property?
Yeah, so a lot of our Warm Homes local grant, our Warm Homes social housing scheme, which our interventions that are deliberately geared towards low-income households will do a lot of the heavy lifting, I think, in social housing and council housing properties. But our view is the problem at the moment, so there's been lots of progress in the social housing sector. We want to focus on that because there is a fuel poverty issue that we need to deal with. But the private rented sector is where we know we've got a big problem in terms of home upgrades. And regulation will do some of that. But we're hoping that some of the incentives we're putting in place, the boiler upgrade scheme, parts of what's available through ECO will get to that cohort. And then critically, we've got to persuade owner-occupiers to also take this on. So at the moment, we are geared towards social low-income households, not all in social rented sector. So it's more the income profile of the people that we're trying to target. But in the end, and I just emphasize this, we have got to get this to everyone. And I think there is a tier of people in the middle that we've got to reach and we've got to persuade to take on the upgrades.
Yeah, and the ONS has made the point to us that it's actually owner-occupied housing that's the most energy inefficient overall. Have you got a particular answer to how you address that challenge?
Yeah, I mean, look, so we're doing three things. We're running a big campaign that we're ramping up next year in order to get the message out that there are schemes in place and there's support in place, like the boiler upgrade schemes, to get people to take on the upgrades. A lot of it, we've got suppliers that are campaigning, so they're getting in touch with households at the moment to persuade them to do this. And then we're trying to think about what trusted intermediaries look like. So that is the role of local regional government. That's the role of, our advice service. But there is a big job to reach people, to persuade them to go on this journey. And at the moment, we're thinking about the set of levers that we have, how effective they are, and how we build on those going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned Hearts and Minds before. I think that that's obviously something that you recognise. How do you persuade people to take part?
We listen to start off with, and we're doing a lot of outreach, we're doing a lot of surveys, we're doing a lot of talking to communities. And certainly what I've learnt is, in the end, people are persuaded by, a lot of people are persuaded by the carbon impacts and the green credentials of doing this, but mostly they are persuaded about whether this is good for their pockets. And I think the challenge for us as we design the Warm Homes programme is that there has to be a benefit in terms of bill reductions. Now, all the evidence suggests that when we have done upgrades, that has reduced energy bills, about £200 on average, but that is a good measure. And so whatever the intervention, the calculation for consumers is this cost effective for me at the outset? And we need to make that as easy as possible for people. But critically, long run, will this save me bills? And if the answer to those questions is no, people won't take it up. If the answer to it is yes, we believe that they will. Our job is to make sure the answer is yes through a set of interventions that we're thinking about. That means that you can have installs and upgrades, whether that is insulation or solar panel or heat pumps, and it's cost effective for the consumer. If we can't deliver that through the scheme, we won't deliver the sort of scale of uplift that we want to see.
Okay, now the energy price cap rose by nearly £150 in October. It's going to go up again. But the Warm Homes plan, as I understand, isn't due to start till after the winter. Why have you delayed?
So there's been no delay. So what we've said is that there's a comprehensive strategy that's coming out, which we will publish in the spring, in part because, as I said, to get from up to 300,000 to the millions, which is what we're aiming for, requires a comprehensive strategy. And we have to look at each component, what's working well, what do we need to change. But we were really clear that we wanted to hit the ground running. So, for example, our Warm Homes local grant, schemes are happening at the moment, upgrades are happening, same with the social housing decarbonisation, same with eco. So we are delivering upgrades, we haven't stopped. I think the work that we are doing now is how do we go from a baseline of, up to 300,000 to the scale of intervention that we want to see. And, we're 4 months into a government. It takes time to look at every aspect of that. And we wanted to make sure that when we pushed out the full strategy, we'd done the work to deliver that outcome.
Okay, so you're not delaying, but you are waiting until the comprehensive strategy is ready. That sounds like a delay.
Well, so, over the course of the next year, there is £3.2 billion that will be going into upgrades. Up to 300,000 homes will be upgraded. We've got the minimum energy efficiency standards, which we are driving through at the moment. So we are getting on with the job. I think for us there is how do we make sure that we're maintaining a baseline, because what we can't have is a supply chain collapse or there be a hiatus or not deliver. But there is a step change that needs to be delivered, and that's what we will put in our strategy.
Okay. And can you say when the Warm Homes Plan will be published in full and the fuel poverty strategy?
So Warm Homes Plan in the spring. In the spring.
Fine spring.
Indeed, is a long time, but it's so.
We should say to you that we remember governments of the recent past saying spring, and August, September may have been where things were delivered.
Look, what I'd say is, in the end, if we want to deliver the shift that we need to deliver in year 3, 4, 5 of this Parliament, we have to have a strategy out by spring. And, there is an interdependency with the spending round, because we've got an initial settlement. We're still negotiating our wider settlement. But I'm very, very clear that unless we are telling the sector this is what we're doing and getting everyone on board, we will not deliver the uplift that we need to in this Parliament. And my single job is to help deliver that uplift in this Parliament.
Right, we will watch with great interest. The UK Green Building Council estimates that 29 million homes need to be retrofitted by 2050. Are you on progress? Is the government on progress? Is the UK on progress to reach net zero in 2050?
We will make sure we do everything that we can to be on track. I think the record of the last government and what was inherited is not as we would have wanted it. So some of the progress that had been made, I think there has been stalling in different areas. Our job now is to turn that around. So everything that we are doing, from retrofitting through to our clean power mission, is all in order to accelerate and to make up for lost time. So on many of the metrics, some of them we're on target, others we're not quite where we want to be. Our job is to make sure that we catch up.
Right. Final question from me before I pass on to the next person. Many charities estimate that fuel poverty levels in England are far higher than government figures suggest. Do you believe that the low-income, low-energy efficiency metric remains appropriate?
So what I would say is, as a measure of the intersection between income and the quality of your home and your ability to heat that home, it is a good measure. And we've got a target, we've got a statutory target, we've got a duty to make sure that we are doing everything we can to hit that target. As a measure of how people feel about energy and affordability, it's not. And so if our numbers are just over 3 million people are in fuel poverty. If you go out into the country and ask people, a lot more people than that will say that they're in fuel poverty because they're spending a huge chunk of their income on energy that they cannot afford. And they would define themselves as fuel poverty, even though technically they're not. I think our job as we sort of think about the fuel poverty strategy is to make sure that we are thinking about both the technical statutory definition of fuel poverty, because that's what we've got a legal obligation to respond to. But I think we also need to speak to the wider question of affordability. And what that looks like, I think, will be the thing that comes out of the review and the strategy. And the metrics we use to do that will be a function of that. But in the end, look, the way that I see this is have all the metrics and the targets and your numbers you want. If people don't feel it on the ground, you are not delivering. And our job is to make sure that people feel it on the ground.
So the figures used by the charities suggest as many as 9 million homes are in fuel poverty might be a better indicator than the 3 million used by government figures.
So, a lot of the charities use the 10% of your income on energy as a metric. I think, look, we need to review that because in some respects that 10% number is quite arbitrary. But what I wouldn't dispute is that for a lot of people, and a larger number than 3 million, energy doesn't feel affordable and it feels crushingly punitive at the moment. And whatever we do over the course of this Parliament, we've got to have an answer to both the legal statutory obligation and an answer to people who think that something that is an essential good is unaccessible and unaffordable for them. And that status quo is completely unacceptable and untenable for us.
Thank you very much. Luke Murphy.
Thanks very much. Welcome, Minister and Olivia and Jessica. My question is really kind of building on the Chair's question. Is you're talking about the national plan to be brought forward next year. Some of the main criticisms of the previous government, which I think or schemes of the previous government, which you've already highlighted, were that they were too complicated, too numerous, too short term. I wonder whether you agree with that assessment and whether you are looking at significant simplification in terms of the plan next year, and how do you tackle the tension there is with certainty around changing schemes that may have been in place for some time?
Yes. Brilliant question. So yes, I agree with the analysis, and I come at it partly thinking about it as a consumer trying to navigate the landscape, but also thinking about it as an installer trying to navigate the landscape. And it is too complicated. We've got lots of schemes that are all well-intentional, trying to solve particular parts of the area, but if you're trying to navigate through that landscape, it's very, very hard to. And the same is true of both delivery as it is, our metrics for kind of standards accreditation. It's quite a complicated landscape. We have suffered from the fact that we don't have long-term certainty. So if you are an installer or a supplier trying to think about how you ramp up, it's been very, very hard. And unfortunately, there's been lots of sort of stop and start with government that hasn't built confidence. We've got to try to change that. And what I hope we will deliver through the Warm Homes Plan is give people a trajectory in the long term so they know where we're going. Try to think about the opportunities to align and integrate our schemes so that in the end, if you are a home or a community, it's very easy to navigate. And that for the supply chain that we need to build up, we are making it as easy as possible because it's a huge ramp-up effort. And if it's too complicated, if it's too patchy, it's very, very hard for people to navigate.
Thanks. Are you committed to any of the schemes in the long term, or are they all kind of under review? You're thinking about ECO and the Great British Insulation Scheme. Is the government guaranteeing their life beyond 2026?
So, look, I think what everyone, and hopefully the signals that we've sent around the sort of original, the 3.4 billion that's been committed by the government over the course of the next 3 years, is that we will absolutely have a scheme for social housing. We will absolutely have a scheme that is geared towards local authorities helping communities and households in need. We will absolutely have a scheme that works with our suppliers in order to reach people. I think the collective question that we're asking at the moment is how do we make them work better? And in the end, the job is, for the resources in the system, how do we get from up to 300,000, which is where we are, to the millions, which is where we need to get to over a period of time. And so we need to get those schemes to work better. We need to get them to work harder. We need to get them to work in a more integrated way. And it's worth saying that actually there's a lot of innovation that's already happening. So the last tranche of ECO, for example, EcoFlex, has allowed quite a lot of innovation. Local authorities working with suppliers. I'd give the example of E.ON, who are doing some really interesting work with Coventry to think about how you could combine area-based local insights with the insights that suppliers bring. And the bit of work we're doing now is like, well, what have we learned that it hasn't been as we would like? What's working well, what's not working well, and how do we design the different schemes to do that?
Thanks. I guess two follow-up questions. One of the witnesses earlier welcomed the longer-term commitment that the government has provided around some of the schemes, but was clear that actually they needed to see even longer certainty, 5 to 10 years even, and they talked about Homes England as being this was a social housing provider, Stonewater, as being a kind of model for that. And I just wonder, A, is that something that the government is looking at to provide that genuine certainty for the supply chain and consumers? And then secondly, one of the other things raised is the difficulties around eligibility, and suppliers just finding they're finding it incredibly hard to find the right people that are actually eligible. And the eligibility is there for good reason, but can it be simplified in order to make it easier? I mean, is that something you're also looking at?
Yeah, so I'll come to just on the eligibility. So on long-term certainty, absolutely. I see this as infrastructure, and my general bias is that infrastructure programs ought to be long-term, partly because you need to gear up your investors, you need to gear up your supply chain. You will understand that there is in government always a tension between that long-term certainty and the ability of, rightly so, colleagues in the Treasury to have a grip on the finances and how we are spending it. So there is a conversation now about actually, what's the certainty we can provide around direction, targets, where we're going, that I think will do quite a lot of the work, because at the moment I don't think industry has had that. And then to what extent can we complement that with certainty on multi-year funding? So we've got the 3-year settlement, which is good. I want and hope we can kind of build on that so that we can say government is in this for the long term, but we need to crowd in other investment in order to deliver the scale of upgrades that we need to see.
I mean, just to add 2 points to that, the point about eligibility is absolutely key to what the Minister was saying about how the schemes work together. We know that our low-income schemes, so social housing, local grant and eco, have slightly different criteria for who's eligible, and that's exactly an example of the sort of thing that we want to make work better as a system. And then the other point I would make is that in thinking about this transition for the whole of the UK through to net zero by 2050 and the 28 million households, we're very much trying to think about it in terms of customer segmentation, and so it's sort of it's the customer groups that each scheme is trying to reach, and also the extent to which they are focused on fabric or focused on the heat transition. And you need to think about those two things together to make sure that the schemes are being as effective as possible.
Can I have a bit of a follow-up? Interesting that point you made at the end about fabric versus heat. My experience as a councillor dealing with the delivery on the ground, and particularly now as an MP with casework, is that the eco scheme in particular is failing, even when ostensibly companies are working on behalf of local authorities. Poor contracts, ways where you discharge your duties simply by going around and saying, oh yes, it'll be fine, and then getting a letter saying, no, sorry, it won't be. The wrong stuff being installed, people not knowing how to operate the systems in place. I'm afraid almost this spaghetti soup, this alphabet soup of schemes is not designed around people, and then we wonder why we chuck loads of money, which the Treasury should be interested in, and kit, which local authorities and companies should be interested in, that is not solving the problem. So I would put the challenge back to the department that not only should you just make sure that the existing schemes work well together, but we actually reform those schemes, calculate how much money that there is there, and design it around the people that actually need this help.
And look, and I wouldn't disagree with that. I think if you take something like eco, it has delivered the largest numbers of interventions of all of our schemes. When it works well, but it's not working well consistently. So we are looking at that in the round, and I completely agree that, in the end, this is about persuading people to go on this journey, and it therefore has to be as consumer-centred as possible. And it also has to be of really good quality. And my biggest worry is that, for every bad example, it generates it's amplified, it creates its own folklore. And this is all about trust, and people have to trust that this is good for them. So I think there is a responsibility on us to make sure that when things aren't working, we have to reform it, because we're about to go and ask millions and millions of people to, work on trust and go on this journey. And if there's a sense that there is, my neighbour had this example or this from my auntie, it absolutely dents the reputation of what we're trying to do. So we're very, very alive to that. And the thing that we're doing at the moment is exactly that. What is working? Where are their problems? Let's drill down to understand if it's not working, why it's not working, and then use that to inform the way that we try and reform the programme in the round in order to deliver the level of uplift that we need to see.
Just to follow up on what you said about ECO delivered 265,000 measures in 2023 out of a total of 318,600 energy efficiency measures, but only 83,500 households were upgraded across all schemes. That is a long way off. Relying on eco doesn't sound like a way of succeeding.
And we won't be relying on eco. I think it will be one of the measures. Again, I come back to the fact that we've got to use, if you like, all the, eco is an obligation, not a funding stream, but, all the levers in the system in order to think about how we get them to work well together to deliver. But, my view is you've got to combine what we're doing with suppliers with, for example, what we're doing on the ground. So there is a big emphasis on what we've learnt from our Warm Homes Local Grant, what we've heard from our Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, is the role of local and regional government in this. And when you're trying to get to scale, when you also talk about trust, that trusted intermediary that can go and knock on a whole load of doors and persuade them to go on this journey, I think there's a really critical role for them. But, I think we would recognise that to get from where we are to where we need to be, there is a delivery piece that we need to bottom out. That's the work that we're doing. And actually, that's an area where, the committee are looking at this in the round. We are definitely in the market for insights and ideas.
Okay. Luke Murphy, have you got any more questions on Right, it is over to you now, colleague.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you about incentivising the electrification of heat.
Yes.
Now, obviously, you'll know that there's some challenges around placing social and environmental levies on electricity bills, which is where they currently are. Do you agree that doing that encourages consumers to keep their fossil fuel heating systems? And if so, what are the plans for reforming that pricing structure?
So it is absolutely the case that at the moment there is a differential between the price of gas and electricity, and that has a knock-on effect on the running cost of something like a heat pump, and that's a problem for us because we need the running cost to be as cheap, if not cheaper, than the cost of a gas boiler. And it's worth saying that, to be fair, the market is coming to help us a little bit. So there are some very creative tariffs that are out there that means that despite the fact that there is that differential, they're still cost effective, they're still delivering savings for consumers. So, if you, no doubt when you spoke to experts, they will all say rebalancing and that this needs to happen. There is a tension for us to manage between how you do that and how you make sure that you're protecting consumers. And certainly, from my perspective, doing it in a way that disproportionately impacts on low-income households on gas is not something that we would want to countenance in the context of a cost of living crisis and where energy bills are at the moment. So we are thinking through what the options are to incentivise that shift to electricity that we need to see, but doing it in a way that protects consumers.
Okay. There's some research that shows that even if installing a heat pump was free, less than a quarter of households would install them. Does the government believe it can achieve its ambition for a heat pump rollout without an enforced phase of enforced phase out?
So look, we're not in the market for forcing this on people. Because in the end, I think that we've got to try to win hearts and minds, as I said, and I think we've got to try and take consumers on this journey. The thing that gives me hope is three things. We know that heat pumps are 3 times more efficient than gas boilers. So actually, in terms of not just the carbon savings, but the amount of electricity that you would use, I think there is an upside for consumers. We need to make sure that we've got the incentives right, and that is a combination of upfront cost, as well as running costs, and we're trying to work through that at the moment. And in the end, there will have to be a big campaign. I don't just mean that like a public awareness campaign, but actually on the ground in order to drive the shift. So we've made a strategic bet on heat pumps, but also heat networks as well.
I was going to ask about heat networks, because heat networks are almost inevitably compulsory. You move into a place, it's connected up. Now, I know that our European neighbours are much more used to that. Increasingly in new builds, we are getting more used to it here, but there are what I might politely call some teething problems around some of those. So are we really confident, are you really confident as a government that you can actually say that and nothing will be compulsory?
So, so on heat networks, the way that I see it is it's a big opportunity for us to deliver the scale that we want, particularly in urban areas where we've got heat networks that are working in partnership with the local government, like they are working and they're a huge opportunity. I think to sell them, there has to be a really clear community benefit. The schemes that I've seen that work is where the community feels we've got a stake in this heat network, so it's not something that's imposed on us. There's a benefit in terms of local jobs and impact on our local community that we like anyway, because it sort of builds positivity around a scheme. But critically, there are benefits in terms of the, bills, quite frankly. And so the question that we are asking the sector is, if we are doing this and you are in, Greater Manchester, what's the proposition for the consumer and communities that means that they buy into this? Because we cannot design something where we put all this investment in and then in 20 years' time, consumers feel that they're locked into something that they have no agency, no control, no benefit from, because there will be a backlash. So we now have an opportunity to actually design these in a way that delivers that community benefit. And I think that's central to the approach that we're trying to take.
Okay, can I follow on with a question about the delayed introduction of the clean heat market mechanism? You've moved that to April 2025 and you've reduced the fines by more than 80%. How is that going to keep the UK on track to install 600,000 heat pumps per year by 2028?
Yeah, so look, 3 things to say about the clean heat market mechanism. The whole purpose of the market mechanism is to kind of gear the supply side to shift from gas boilers and to drive the manufacturing of heat pumps. In our view, my view when I came in was we've got to try and do this with industry, because in the end we need all those boiler manufacturers to want to do this. And if you speak to them, they will say, of course, if there is a market for heat pumps, we'll go there. It's in our commercial interest. And a lot of them are operating in European countries where heat pumps are produced at a much higher rate than here. So we wanted to keep the incentive, but a key part is the demand side. And they will tell you, we can produce heat pumps, but they're in our storehouses. So unless we can increase consumer demand for this, there is a collective problem. And the approach I took was, okay, let's work on the demand side together. And a big part of that is how we get costs down. So we need you to innovate in order to bring down the cost of heat pumps, quite frankly. We also need you to work with your installers, because at the moment, installers are the interface between the manufacturing and the consumer. And, there is installer skepticism, quite frankly, about heat pumps. And so there's a bit of work to do to train, to make sure we're putting the right incentives. And my view is that let's work together on that, as well as making sure we have a supply side incentive. My criticism of the last government, candidly, is that there was a lot of focus on the supply side. And I didn't believe that without addressing the demand side, we would deliver the change that we want. Year 1 is our baseline of the scheme. We will learn from that and it will evolve. But the key for me is that this has to be a partnership with industry, because we want those boilers to be successful and we want them to hit the target. At the moment, they're telling me that they want to hit that target as well. Our collective job is to make sure that they do. And then critically think about how we put demand-side interventions and supply-side interventions that gets us there. So we aren't resiling from the target, which is the thing that drives it. And in the end, I think there's a collective job to work together to make sure we are delivering that target. And I'm pretty confident that we will get to, our 6% year 1 target. And as long as we can do that, I think we can work with them in a collaborative way.
This is a slightly sidebar point, but the Future Home Standard would help quite a lot, wouldn't it?
So it will when it comes. I mean, the target that we have for the 6% target is for installs. So in some respects, the future home standards and new builds doesn't contribute to that because in the end there's a big, if you like, existing stock installation problem that we need to deal with. But absolutely, in terms of demand side, certainty, pipeline, confidence amongst suppliers.
Installers, supply chain.
100%. And that message is coming very clear to us. We are working very closely with our colleagues in MHCLG to make sure that we respond to the consultation and get it out. But we are very, very clear that this has to be part of the mix and that we also can't faff around for too long and we need to get it out.
Okay, one more question, particularly on the infrastructure. Has the government established what the necessary cost of network reinforcement would be to support a widespread rollout of heat pumps? I know there's a lot of talk about how much the grid, whether it can stand everyone electrifying their heat. What is the government's assessment of that?
So it's absolutely part of the work programme. We work really closely with the people that are modelling on the supply side. I don't have the figures right to hand, but
I know it's more of a kind of NESO mission control element, but it is one of those things that in the conversations, dare I say it, at the barroom bores that we are, is somebody's going to say to us, nah, can't possibly be done because the grid won't handle it. We will need to know what the answers are to that and really be able to test whether we're confident that the heat electrification programme that you're embarking on does properly interact with the plans for the grid upgrade.
Absolutely. And look, this intersects with Minister Shank's portfolio. What I would say is that we are very alive to the problem, and both the NESO but also the work that's been done by our sort of Clean Power Mission team is looking at this question. We've got to get the right mix of infrastructure. We need to make sure that the grid isn't a bottleneck, but we also need to think about what that transition looks like and actually how the grid changes as we make that transition. And so that's been looked at in the round. There is a lot that we are trying to do pretty quickly, so we are updating the analysis at the moment. We're thinking about the different scenarios, but the boss has made sure that we've got that question front and centre of our mind.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea if he wrote to us to set out the detail, because as probably Billington's just been saying, I think this is absolutely fundamental, isn't it? Great, thank you very much indeed. Chris Choate.
Thank you. The precursor to having a heat pump is you've got to have a well-insulated home. Do you think you're giving enough emphasis to the issue of insulation? Because on insulation, that's where you've already won the hearts and minds of people. Most people want to have a well-insulated home, but they don't want to buy into having to change their gas boiler for an ineffectual heat pump. And you've got the same problem with the demand as there is for people who are trying to sell electric vehicles into the private consumer market. There's a lot of resistance. And that's all linked in, isn't it, with scepticism about whether there is any necessity for having these net zero targets. And aren't all the problems that we're describing largely flowing from having an unrealistic net zero target?
So maybe if I can respond to that and chunk it up in sort of three parts. So let me take the kind of question of the net zero target head on. There is a net zero imperative around this, but for me there is also an affordability and a consumer imperative around this. And why I say that is the current status quo where we have over-reliance on fossil fuels as the mechanism for powering the economy and heating our homes is not working for consumers. And if we had any doubt, the energy crisis that we've just come out of, I think is the thing that sort of disabuses of that doubt. So there is a kind of consumer good for people in terms of warm homes and homes that are cheaper to run that is driving everything we are trying to do in the Warm Homes Plan. And, candidly, that takes primacy over everything else as we do that sort of transition. I think the second thing I'd say is it's not either or, and actually the approach that we need to take, and I think over the history of, if you like, upgrades, there's even overemphasis on, fabric first, or it's about heat, clean heat, but, my view is that we've got to take the house as it is, and for some homes, actually they will be energy efficient enough that you can put in a heat pump and it works and people are warm and they're not having to pay a fortune. For other homes, you will need fabric upgrades, and the flexibility I think we need to create in the scheme is to allow your installer and provider to figure out what works for that particular consumer, what works for that type of home, to put the right interventions. But I would end by saying that, actually demand for heat pumps in particular. So if we think about our boiler upgrade scheme, we've had the highest number of applications on record this October. So people are clocking on, and actually my problem is it tends to be consumers with deeper pockets that are benefiting from this. And once people, all the surveys suggest once you get a heat pump, people love it. And we need to make sure that it's not just those, at the top that can access this, but it's accessible to everyone, including low-income households. And a lot of the thinking now is like, well, how do we make this an affordable proposition and a desirable proposition? Because if we get that right, there is genuinely a consumer benefit to this.
Thank you. Luke Murphy.
Thank you very much. You talked about working with industry, which I completely agree with. We had a representative for the industry here earlier today, and I would say was urged caution at the extreme around the benefits of heat pumps from their point of view, and cautioned around the costs. Are you sure that they're on board in the way in which you described? Because and have they been let off the hook? Because they were also quite critical about the clean heat market mechanism as well. Yeah,
look, so candidly, we've got insurgent, parts of the sector, the likes of Octopus, that are on board. They can see both the consumer benefit, but also the commercial benefit. They're putting big amounts of investment. They're doing, lots of work on innovation to get this, because they think this is the future. And the lessons from other parts of the world is that this will be a big part of what we do. The boiler manufacturers, and I imagine your representative was from the sort of boiler manufacturing world, they are on board, but in the end they've got a captured market with gas boilers. Now, what most of them will say to us is, we're producing heat pumps on the continent, because most of them will have, they're rooted here, but they're also in the continent. So it's not that there is an aversion. My view is that we need them to go on this journey. And once it makes commercial sense, they will move. And what we're trying to do through policy is design it so it makes commercial sense. And that is about the upfront costs, that is about the running costs. But that's also making sure that we are, creating the right incentives on the supply side for that move to happen. But what I would say to them is, gas boilers, yes, will be part of the mix. We're not going to force people to rip out their gas boilers. But in the long term, they know that that's not a long-term solution, and they are candid about that with us. Their issue is we want to try and work together to get to that outcome. And our frustration, quite frankly, with the last administration is that we weren't working in partnership and that government wasn't listening. We are listening, but we're very, very clear about our ambition. And the first conversation I had with them is like, we are not resiling from the ambition here, but we will work together on the barriers. And we understand that there are demand-side barriers. We understand that there are installer barriers. Our job is to work together to bypass that.
Thank you. Young.
Thank you. So the previous government committed to make a decision about the role that hydrogen would play in decarbonising heating in 2026, but there were calls at the time for this to be brought forward because of the systemic uncertainty it was creating, and of course there were knock-ons like the future of the gas grid, gas network. So firstly, I'd like to ask you, have you reached a decision on the role of hydrogen? And if not, when can we expect this?
So we inherited the programme of work on hydrogen from the last government. That is still ongoing. And we are committed to reviewing and examining the impact of, the role of hydrogen in home heating. We know that there are calls across the piece for us to, speed that up. We're trying to do it in the right way. We're trying to make sure that we have looked at the evidence base in the way that the last government committed to, and we are committed to, and we will be coming out on that in due course.
How are you going to balance the need to decarbonise homes quickly and at a large scale with giving consumers a choice about how they heat their homes in the future?
Well, look, two things I'd say. We will do the work on hydrogen, and we need to do the work on hydrogen properly. Our view is, when we look at the technological mix, and the reason why, in some respect, the government is making a strategic bet on heat pumps, is that we've looked at the range of technologies, and we think heat pumps make sense. Partly because of the efficiency that we've talked about, partly because if we can get the kind of, if you like, the cost metrics right, we think it is a kind of viable solution. And our ability to kind of install it, we think we can do it at pace. And so, there will be a balance. But I think the key for us is, we've done the evidence based on the technology. Now all the other work we need to do to make sure that we are making it as easy for people as possible needs to be the thing that comes next.
On the work on the technology, surely that means you can make an announcement about that decision sooner. If the work you're still doing is about how you make that easy for customers, that can come after the decision about what the technology is going to be, because I'm getting on to the next question I've got, which is about the future of the gas network and whether you have a plan for how that can be decommissioned, if that's the way you see it going. If the future of heating is electric, well, what role do you see for the gas network in the future? If it needs decommissioning, you need a plan for that. Why would you not make the decision about the technology? If you've done the work on the decision about the technology, why not announce that now?
Well, so the review is ongoing, and there are parts of the review that we still need to complete that we inherited, and I think it is right that we do that properly. It's not lost on us that people want a decision, and that's as much on the gas network side as it is on advocates of heat pumps, and we recognise that. But I think it is right that we do this bit of work. But I don't look, wherever we end up on hydrogen, we know that heat pumps are going to have a big role to play. So we think, and we are confident, that we can make the strategic bet on heat pumps and do the policy around that. And then the question that we are asking is, what is the role alongside electrification of hydrogen? And there's a whole set of issues. We know we will definitely have hydrogen in the context of commercial and industrial. It is a question of what's the role in homes, and we're trying to do that work properly in order to announce.
Yeah.
So, turning to the issue of those who are living off the gas grid at the moment and transitioning to low carbon heating, I mean, it sounds very much like you're betting the house on heat pumps, but we've been told that for many off-grid homes you'll be looking at renewable liquid fuels, and we haven't had the promised consultation yet on the renewable liquid heating fuel obligation. So when will you publish that consultation?
So let me make a wider point, and then I'll ask Jess about the specific, or Olivia about the sort of specific consultation. Yes, we're making a strategic bet on heat pumps, but I think my view and our view is that in the end we've got to get to the right solution for different types of homes, which is why, for example, I think heat networks have an important role to play, and we need to make sure that we've got a clear answer. Now, we think heat pumps works for a lot of our off-grid rural communities, but it won't work for all of them. So we are open and we are keeping in constant review what the set of technologies that might work for those households are. And, I've had lots of MPs get in touch with me asking me the specifics of that question, and what I've said is we will keep all technology under review, and the thing that will guide us is the evidence base around the efficiency of it, the cost to consumers, and the ease of delivering it. And those are the criteria by which we take a strategic bet on, whether this makes sense and whether we're willing to put government investment and funding. It's worth saying the private sector cracking on and doing lots of things and lots of technologies, but this is about where government support and subsidy comes in. And those are the three criteria that kind of guide what we're trying to do.
Okay,
to answer the specific question about...
We're going to have to write to you on the specific answer there.
I can do that one if you want. So just on rural properties, for the sort of small number of properties where a heat pump might not be a suitable solution, there are other options. So at the moment, the bus scheme does support biomass heating systems for rural properties. Yeah. So that is an option for a number of properties. And we do recognise that renewable liquid fuels, like the sort of hydro-treated vegetable oil and renewable liquefied petroleum gas, like they could play a limited role, but it's a very sustainable biomass is a really limited resource, and we expect to sort of prioritise the use of that resource in sectors where there aren't alternatives, like solid biomass. There's also a risk as well that the cost of that resource for use in domestic heating is very high. So whilst we obviously have, there are powers in the Energy Act that the previous government took to look at that obligation. At the moment, we're basically keeping the evidence there under review.
So you're not necessarily going to publish the consultation at all?
We're keeping the evidence under review because of the challenges on affordability and availability.
Now you've mentioned biomass. Do you count Drax as being a sustainable part of biomass?
I mean, it's obviously a sort of different set of issues around large-scale biomass generation, but obviously there are very stringent sustainability requirements in place associated with biomass in large-scale electricity generation.
Didn't sound like a yes.
I mean, well yes, I suppose so. That they're supported as a renewable technology, and there are standards in place which ensure that the fuel source comes from sustainable forestry.
Okay, we can pursue that elsewhere, but something else actually on biomass. Are you looking at extending the use of sewage for production of sustainable biomass, something that other countries are doing more of?
So on that one, I'm afraid, if you're talking in respect of electricity generation, we might have to, more generally, we might have to write to you. That's sort of beyond.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, you're finished. Great. Torquil Crichton, please.
Thank you, Chair, Minister, Olivia, Jessica. Thank you for coming in. Almost on home straight. I just want to pick up on something you said, Minister, about confidence and trust, because there's a feeling that consumers are lost in retrofit land, that half the people don't know where to go for independent advice, even though everyone is worried about their energy bills. You've got things like these energy performance certificates, which can be contrary as well. They can advise people to fit a gas boiler rather than a heat pump, as you suggest. So I just wondered what you're doing to kind of adjust these certificates and advice, and how you're going to kind of restore consumer confidence.
I mean, very good question. So we are reforming the energy performance certificate, and in fact, I think the consultation came out today, hot off the press, and it's been a shared endeavour between ourselves and MHCLG. And in part, the reforms try to do a number of things to make it far more easy and accessible for consumers, but to make sure that the metrics that we're measuring by captures the range of things that we want to see in the household. So from smart readiness, fabric performance, the clean heat dimension to that, the cost dimension to that. So it's a far more comprehensive picture of the home than we think the current certificate provides. So we are hoping that will help. But I think there's another piece, which is just navigating through the landscape and the advice that's there for people and what the sort of trusted advice system is. Now we've got digital platform, we've also got helpline, we've got local demonstrators, but I think if I'm candid, it probably doesn't do the thing of being a one-stop shop that people can reach for, that they even know it's there, quite frankly, and that allows them to navigate through the system. So one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, in a world where we need to make this as easy for consumers as possible, there's one place you go, you pick up your phone, you get advice that you can trust, and that helps you navigate through the system. That's one of the questions that we're thinking about. How do we build on what we have to get something that's far more visible, accessible, but critically makes the journey very, very easy?
Good, thanks. You also mentioned that people would buy into this when it made sense for them, when they got something out of it. One of the suggestions we heard from an earlier panel was that things like linking energy efficiency improvements to things like a stamp duty reduction, which would increase the value of your house, possibly. Sounded like a good idea. What do you think about that?
I mean, you wouldn't possibly expect me to comment on a Treasury policy, but what I would say... So what I would say is that I think there is a question about at what point you put incentives in the system and triggers. And we know that there are points that people are more likely to engage. And when you're moving home, if you're ever going to do upgrades to your home, that's a point where people will engage. It's the same that, for example, when you're upgrading your boiler, that's a point in which you will engage. So we are thinking about what are those trigger points and what are the sorts of incentives that you might put in place to shift behaviour and get people to sort of think about this.
Yeah. The banks are saying that they've already got green finance products to help to get people to commit to upgrading their homes when they buy them. Are you looking at that as well? Sorry, Jessica.
No, we absolutely are. I was just going to bring together the 2 points of your question actually, which is around. So we're very aware that all the consumer surveys say that government is a trusted source of advice, but they're not the only place that people go to. And so, for example, with the clean heat market mechanism, part of the idea is to engage the workforce in the sort of transition that we're looking to see, and also the financial intermediaries as well. So when you're getting a mortgage, you're talking to them. They are a point of contact about what you might be doing in your home. And yes, we are very active, very actively looking at the green finance market and what's available. But what we hear back is that it's a question of demand.
Can I also just follow up on that? The GFI and others are looking at particular regulatory changes that might increase the possibility of people being able to borrow against the cost of their property and for the debt to sit on the property rather than on the person, which might increase the possibility of people being able to invest long term in the fabric transformation of their home. Now, I've been banging on about this for more time than I care to mention. I'd be interested to hear, now we have a government that might be, whether this government is going to be open to that when previous governments have not made that regulatory change.
So we are definitely, we recognise that there's a job to be done in terms of the cost and financing of this, and we're looking at the range of options at the moment. There are lots of products in the market, people aren't taking them up, so we're asking ourselves the question of why is that, and what might you design that is different to do that. And my objective is to get as close to low upfront costs as we can, because that is a big barrier to people engaging. And I think there are lots of different ways that we can do that, from low-cost loans, green mortgages, through to things like subscription models that some of the manufacturers are kind of piloting at the moment. And we are looking at all of them and trying to think about what's the right set of interventions that can get through over that upfront barrier.
And just one last question, because you mentioned mortgages there, Jessica. Some mortgage lenders won't lend against homes now that have spray foam in the loft, and that was fitted under government schemes. I wonder what lessons have been learned by the department in that, and how that will change in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, there has been extensive engagement with the mortgage industry to ensure that there's sort of up-to-date guidance, and we have seen an improvement in the position in terms of the how they approach the lending decision. So we're very aware of the issue, and it's absolutely something that we're learning lessons from in thinking.
about 250,000 homes that are affected by this, yeah?
I don't have the figures to hand, but yes.
Yeah, that's the figure we've had. I think it was that was a Sunday Times report as well, wasn't it? Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Josh McAllister.
Thank you very much, Chair, and welcome to the Select Committee. My constituency, there's a number of constituencies at this sort of top end, but 2/3 of homes sit below acceptable energy efficiency standards. And one of the obstacles is the workforce being in place to do upgrades for things like heat pumps. The Heat Pump Association suggests that there's only 11,000 qualified heat pump engineers in the UK at the moment, and that needs to treble in order to get to where we need to be at by 2028. I've got a very small scale and positive development in my constituency, the Green Energy and Skills Centre at Lakes College, which is brilliant, but we're obviously going to need something game-changing to get from 11,000 to 33,000 within 4 years. Can you talk us through the plans that you've got to do that major ramping up of qualified engineers?
Yeah, look, good question. So since 2021, the department has invested over 28 million in skills and training. We are now looking at ways in which we build on that. So we've got our heat training grant, which is about 5 million, that's training people at the moment. I think the lessons that we've learned is where training schemes are working well, it's either because it is manufacturers or suppliers training their supply chain and training installers. We've got great example of local regional government creating skills academies and training en masse. My view is the workforce challenge is a constraint. The thing that makes me relatively optimistic is that we've got 130,000 odd boiler installers, gas boiler installers. The training to become a heat pump installer is about a week and a half. So we can convert the workforce, and we absolutely must convert the workforce. And the work that we're trying to do now is, having learnt the lessons of supplier-led schemes, manufacturer-led schemes, as well as some of the really innovative schemes that are happening through regional local government. How do we bring that together to get the scale that we need? And I think part of it will be place-based. So we've got a sense in the West.
The previous panel just told us that a heat pump engineer earns 10,000 less than a gas boiler installer. How are you? I mean, that's not particularly good cause for optimism based on what you just said.
So,
or have you got different figures?
Well, so I'm not 100% sure about those figures, but what I would say is, look, there is an opportunity and there's a risk for us. The opportunity is, we know that if we get this right, we are talking about lots of jobs that we're creating in every part of the country. But we have to be intentional about making sure that those jobs pay a decent wage. We have to be intentional about the quality of those jobs, and we have to be intentional about the precarity of those jobs. So one of the difficulty for installers is they don't really have a long-term pipeline of work, so it is very precarious. And for me, it's good old industrial strategy. When we do this, there is an opportunity for us to create jobs and to do it in quite an intentional way, and to build up a workforce and to make sure that that workforce has quality and has the wage level that we'd want to see. It's not going to happen by accident. We have to do it in an intentional way. I don't think it's been done in an intentional way in the past. That's the shift that we want to deliver and that we want to create.
Yeah. I think the GMB who were here immediately before that, I think their concern is about that transient nature of any transition, and having had a really established workforce with really good standards, secure work and good pay, that what replaces it is less than that. So is that something the department is working hard to address and reassure the concerns of the GMB and others?
100%, and they're right to raise that as a concern, and that is a legitimate risk if we don't get it right. And so we are very clear that we want to work with the unions, we want to work with the workforce, we want to work with the installers, because I come back to the fact that there is a big opportunity here. But if we aren't intentional about job quality, precarity, wages, training and apprenticeship opportunities for people so that this is a step, it won't happen. And it is the responsibility of us as we design this. So for me, there's a demand side piece, There's a supply side piece, there's a workforce piece, and that's all part of an integrated strategy. And we've got to do some of that work in terms of our national strategy, but there is a big amount of work that needs to be done at the local level, where actually there is a role for local and regional government to think about the workforce, the skills, the skills provision that they're providing, and how they do this in quite an intentional way. And that's a shift from where we are, but that's absolutely where we need to get to.
Thank you. And then the final one.
Come back to you in a minute, because other people jumping in. Claire.
And I don't know if any colleagues wanted to come back on your number, which I didn't recognise.
I didn't recognise the number either.
If you look at the transcript of the session today, you'll be able to see that. And again, if you come back to us, that would be very helpful. Claire Young, please.
Yes, it was just a quick question, Minister, on how you're working with other ministers on the apprenticeship levy, because I was talking to a further education college locally that serves my constituency, although it's not in it, and they were saying that they see big problems with how it's working at the moment, that the big companies are quite often spending the money on their senior employees, they're not spending it at the shop floor, that money's just ending up going back to the Treasury, that there are issues with the bigger companies effectively pinching staff and the smaller companies that don't pay the levy, and so on and so forth. And what they were suggesting was that the levy could be held locally and funneled through further education colleges to train the staff that aren't being trained by the big companies. And I just wonder whether that's the sort of discussion you're having with your ministers from other departments.
Yeah, so, the Education Department are looking at the apprenticeship levy. We know that parts of it are working really well, parts of it aren't working well for some of the reasons that you set out. And reforms are in train. And my colleague, Minister Jones, that's sort of overseeing the jobs and skills part, is working very closely with the DFE. And the question for us is, there's a big workforce training proposition we have, not just actually in retrofitting, but across the green agenda, and how we're using the levers that we have to make sure that it's generally responding to that. So we are working very closely and thinking about how we can, leverage some of those schemes and make them work better to deliver the uplift that we need to see.
Thank you. Analyst Midgley.
Yeah, so another aspect that was raised in terms of incentivisation for the workforce by an earlier panel, the GMB, was also that the amount that you get in a grant versus the amount that the gas engineer has to take off work is not an encouragement for them to take time off the tools, because it's thousands of pounds that they are losing in work. So I was just wondering if you could say what the government's plans are in terms of that, and given that energy is such a high unionised sector, if you could also say a bit about what the government is doing to work with the unions in terms of a plan and pathways around this.
Look, two parts. I think there is just a job we have to do to make sure that there are right incentives for the installers. And I think if you speak to installers on the front line, they will give you a whole host of reasons why, what's pursued in policy terms to be a bias against heat pumps, for example, are a set of things that means that the incentives aren't aligned. And we're trying to look at that in the round so that, once we've done the training, there are incentives to mean that when you go into a household, you are as willing to promote heat pumps as you are gas boilers. So I think that's the first thing. And we don't have the answer on that, but that is what we're absolutely working on at the moment. On the unions more widely, we're absolutely trying to work closely with them. So, we are... I met the TUC recently. We've agreed on a kind of programme of work to address many of the questions that have been raised. So how do we make sure that we're getting insights from workers at the front line as we design this? How are we dealing with the question of job quality? How are we dealing with the question of precarity? How are we dealing with the fact that there are the right financial incentives in the system? And I've made a commitment to work with them as we design the strategy for the Warm Homes Plan, and we'll deliver that. And we're also working with individual unions, GMB obviously, big representation in terms of our gas boiler workforce. And in the end, they are at the coalface of this transition. And we would be mad as a government if we weren't listening to them and learning from them and understanding what our policies feel like on the front line and thinking about how we design, particularly on the workforce and training and incentive side, the right set of interventions that means that the transition we want to see is not just good for consumers, but it's got to be good for the workforce as well.
Josh.
I had a constituency surgery on Saturday morning in Seascale, and there was a resident who had been pretty burned by poor consumer protection, not actually for heat pumps, for solar, but I think there's probably a lot of read across. Is the government concerned that consumer protection and workforce accreditation schemes are adequately protecting customers from occasional dodgy work?
So we are concerned, and the cases that you are picking up in your surgeries are cases that are also filtering up to us, so that there are structural problems. And I think one of the challenges is that we do have standards and accreditation. They're quite complicated. The accountability structures aren't wholly clear. So we're trying to look at it in the round to do two things. One, to make sure that it is accessible and easy to understand for a consumer, and critically to make sure that there are much, much clearer lines of consumer redress. So when something goes wrong, the system kicks in without you having to fight really hard to get the system to work for you to redress. So that's the first thing that we're looking at. And then on the supply and installer side, it's very hard to navigate. Suppliers will tell us it's quite costly to navigate to get the right level of accreditation. And then I think the final thing is, if you are on a government scheme, there's a whole tapestry of accreditation that works. If you're not, good luck.
This individual had actually been through the sort of complaints processes and all that kind of thing, and then fixing work had been done not well, and they went bust. And in those situations, that people are kind of just left completely abandoned by the system.
Yeah. So we recognise that it is not as robust as we need it to be, because I come back to the point about trust and reputation, and I come back to the fact that if we want to persuade millions of people to go on this journey, they have to have complete confidence that when they have an upgrade, it is of the best standard and quality, and when things don't go right, they're not left, and there is a redress mechanism. So we are looking at how we strengthen that in order to deliver that.
Is there a moment where you expect the government to share more details on consumer protections in this space? Is that part of the Warm Homes programme announcement in the spring?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah, you mentioned the government scheme, but being on a government scheme gave protection, and yet the spray foam scandal was on government schemes. There's quite a job of work to be done to overcome that. What reassurance can you give that it really will happen in future?
So just to say that we have got a whole host of intelligence from the ground, that there are problems. We are taking them very seriously, partly because there's a basic question of consumer protection and redress, but more fundamentally, for every bad install, it amplifies in terms of the reputation of what we're trying to do. And it is about trust, and it's about confidence, and people have to feel that this is good for them. And so, I care about it, because if you've got a consumer that's been left in the lurch by a bit of work that's not very good, that's a problem. But it also has huge reputational damage. So it is something that we are trying to get a sense of the scale of the problem. And we're thinking about both, the future protections and mechanisms we put in place, but also what we're doing to make sure that the system is responding to cases where work hasn't been installed properly.
Thank you very much. Minister Miatta, Fahnbulleh, Jessica Skilbeck and Olivia Haslam, Thank you very much indeed for your evidence.
Thank you, committee.
And, can I just finally say, you've promised to write to us. We are producing a report imminently, so we really need your written submission within the next 2 weeks, please, so we can include your comments in the final report. Thank you again. That concludes the session for today. Order.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.